Good evening, all. It's time for some midweek geek. Did you all miss us last week? What's funny there?
I don't know.
I don't know. Hope everyone's well. I see we have a few people watching. I'm going to do the hellos in a little bit because Sean's away in the talking to the porcelain receptacle.
Yes, he's dropping the kids off at the pool, as they say.
As they say, yes. Hello, Doof, and hello, Halakar. How are you, chaps? How are you, indeed? On this very fine, you can see outside, it's a very fine evening here in sunny-ish Britain. Sunny-ish. Obviously, well, there was no midweek geek last week. I do apologise for that. Something happened that sort of took any sort of impetus away from the idea of me streaming. But we're back as normal. Hello, Bear. How you doing? I think we'll start with welcoming at least one of our guests tonight before Sean comes back. So I don't know if anyone else is joining, but hello, Elfbait. How are you doing?
Doing all right. Sorry, I was just putting a note on something real quick. Doing all right. It's been a week.
It's been a week. Yes. It's been 2 weeks. It's been 2 weeks since you.
No gaming really. My Monday game is on permanent hold until we can figure out a better schedule. 2 hours a week, too late at night, like every few weeks is no way to get a campaign going anywhere. So, yeah.
No, you're right. Hello, Andrew. So you haven't had any gaming at all?
Not since Saxious' last game. So
when was that?
That was last Sunday.
It's been since we last streamed.
Oh, I guess so, yeah.
How's that going?
It's going pretty good. We're investing in food. Managing to snag. Basically, my character has become kind of obsessed with making sure that we have proper provisions set aside to ourselves, in addition to helping supply the fort, because I just know at some point it's going to become an issue.
Has he got the spreadsheets going?
If he does, he's not showing them to me because I don't speak spreadsheet.
Hello, Crafting Gamer, and hello, Grumpy Old Slan. Evening, chaps. Evening. So, games-wise, I was on reading something on Reddit the other day, and it was a discussion. And I read this really, really long and in-depth post on alignment and playing different alignments. And then, so I looked up to see who posted it, and it was Saxious. So he's been moonlighting.
I see.
Yes, and it definitely is. It definitely is our Saxious. I could tell from his style of writing.
How many Saxiouses are there?
I don't think it'd be many. Hello, Sean. How you doing?
I'm good. I've got my coffee.
Okay. And have you been playing any games since we last met up on stream? Apart from...
Yes, I was saying I played my OSE game on Friday. Yes. And we had a very fun encounter with a doppelganger and in the Dungeons of Dread, where a group of berserkers came out, confronted the group, and because one of the players had died mid-adventure and we contrived his new character entrance while in the dungeon, the berserkers, when they learned that the new character was not a longtime friend and they met him in the dungeon, they demanded that they kill him because he must be the doppelganger. He must be the skin changer they're after. And so this massive meltdown as one of the players immediately ordered his two retainers to kill the dwarf because he might be a doppelganger, and another player drew his bow to do the same, and the lawful the lawful wizard of the group was like, I can't have any of this. And he put a sleep spell on the entire lot of them, enemies and good guys. It was very funny, yeah.
Is the dwarf still alive, or will we find
Yes,
out?
that was the first one he woke up. He tied up the berserkers and disarmed his fellows, and then woke up the dwarf. And they said, "Okay, let's wake people up one by one and calm them down."
Well, even though I didn't stream last week, I did continue to run and play my games. We had, what did we do? I'm trying to think of the timing of everything, because obviously I've missed a week. Since I've streamed, I've had a Saturday game with Merp, played OSE while I was at work. Naughty. Played some Horror on the Orient Express in Call of Cthulhu, 2 sessions of that. We had quite an amusing encounter where the enemy that they were up against had a 95% hiding ability and a 90% clawing ability, and rarely succeeded because my dice were just rolling stupid numbers. So, but the party were failing as well. It meant they did put an end to it in the end, because it could barely hit them because I was rolling so badly. But hey ho. And last session they managed to annoy a very, very large mute Turkish gentleman who happens to be incredibly tough. So let's see where that takes them. That's proven to be quite amusing. We had a game of. Did I play the Paranoia game before a stream, or have I recounted? Does anyone know whether I've recounted the Paranoia game on a midweek Geek or not?
I don't remember it, but I also have a horrible memory, so there's that.
So one of the Mondays I filled in with a quick one shot with playing Paranoia. It's a scenario called the Stealth Train, and it was highly entertaining. And I'm not going to go into any details because I would like to run it for some of you lot on the channel at some point. But it ended with a very, very big explosion and plenty of carnage. But that's what Paranoia should do. They took a bit of getting into it, unfortunately, because we only got 3 players, and one of them, his dog, had been in for the snip earlier that day. So his dog was demanding his attention, so he kept having to get up and go and make sure his dog was all right, because his dog was a bit sore down there. And he ended up entering the game properly about 40 minutes late, and was still the first character to die. He died within 30 seconds of entering the game.
Yikes.
But it set the tone. It all went to pieces after that. We did our double OSE session on last Saturday, and on Monday, because we've had a few people away and there's new babies and things like that, our big campaigns are slightly on pause. And a friend of mine had written a Funhouse one shot, and he just said, everyone make yourselves 3rd level characters. Make whatever you want, just roll the stats. It really doesn't matter. It's a silly Funhouse adventure. And so I lent into it and made a gnome wizard who has quickly become the single most hated character in the history of that particular group.
Well, he's off to a good start by being a gnome.
They absolutely hate him. They absolutely hate him, because when I play other races, where possible, I do like to try and make them have alien thoughts to human thoughts. Because isn't that supposed to be part of playing a different race in a game? You're meant to try and think a bit differently.
Humans with funny hats.
Yeah, I try to avoid the humans with funny hats thing where possible. And he knew it was going to go bad when we got to introduce our characters, and I just leant forward. Says, and John, so what's your character? And I looked forward to it, and his face went Squeeve, and that was his name, and that's how he spoke for the entire session, and that's how he sang, and that's
how was your voice after the session?
Oh, it absolutely blew my voice away completely. But the other players joined in, and the DM was just sat there going, "Oh my god, oh my god, what have I unleashed here? What have I unleashed?" But no, it was funny.
And that, sir, is why people give up DMing.
Yes. Slan, I did chuckle your epic character creation yesterday. Slan rolled some wonderful stats, 3d6 in line, made the almost perfect thief. Good dexterity, constitution bonus. The only weak stat was charisma. That's only slightly below average, but it was an excellent thief. And then when we play OSE, we roll for hit points. And I at first level, I let my players roll twice and pick the highest. And he rolled 2 1s. Just sod's law after rolling a superb set of stats. So I've been doing a lot, even though I didn't stream last Wednesday. I did stream on Friday, and I did appear on somebody else's stream on Friday, and promptly got drunk. I needed a few beers after last week, which was good. I stayed up to 4:30 in the morning, got it out of my system. Best way to do it. Managed to do lots of gaming anyway, so it was only really Wednesday stream, and my video making has been a bit slow recently because of the worries over what's happening with the job going forward and everything. I've sat down and thought, I've got to do a video, and 2 hours later I'll look up and think, I was supposed to do a video.
It's hard to find the wherewithal when you got something on your mind, though.
Yeah,
exactly.
Your mind is distracted.
Yeah. But we do have some good news. One of our regular suppliers has effectively taken over the running behind the scenes of the business, so we don't have to worry about that. Our jobs are safe.
Oh, cool.
Which is good. It's still a bit of a shock. It was my first proper day back today, and it was weird. It really was weird. But got to get on with it. And that's what the boss would have wanted. So, right. Anyhow, enough of that. Let's get on to our topic for tonight. I don't know if anybody else is joining us. Shall I be very brave and throw the link into chat? I think I shall. It's on the Discord, but
I don't know, man. You're gonna open yourself up to slings and arrows
of outrageous fortune.
Halakar is mentioning that my fire spell is not me. It's not me. It's the hunters up north. They're causing all this smoke.
Damn, that stuff's made it all the way down here to Missouri.
Apparently it's making its way into Europe.
Yeah, I got up this morning. It's the first day. I mean, we get weather, like air quality advisories. Usually it's like, air quality advisory is what it'll say. This morning it just said smoke. Literally, just one word, smoke.
Oh, it's brutal here. I mean, I'm
like, seriously, it's so bad you can't.
You'd think it was a foggy day out today. It's really bad here too.
I guess it's just going down the Mississippi Valley and making its way down here.
Shall I just really annoy you and just look at this? It's a bit damp out there tonight, but this got a little bit of rain. But it's so fresh.
Oh, it'll go away soon. We're about to get a storm. We also have a tornado warning.
So fresh and so clean. And
I'll just take that if a tornado happens around here, I'll just take it like, imagine it as, Superman or the Flash doing their Superman thing and making the smoke go away.
Well, I think I said hello to Squirrel and Kabuki, and there's a few others popped in. Mar Hawkman's here as well. Anybody I haven't said hello to? I don't know. I'm not very good at keeping up. I don't live anywhere near London, Mar Hawkman. I don't live anywhere near London. 120 odd miles away from London. And I'm glad of that, because London is a hole. But hello, Michael. Right, so we do have a topic. We do have a topic. And that is arguing, as we should do. And if you've got something you feel you want to add to this topic, you're more than welcome to join in. But we're arguing about the title of the stream is Tolkien Fantasy is Wrong. No, it isn't. Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
So we're going to talk about things that we demand from fantasy, Tolkien's influence on the fantasy games we play, and what defines fantasy. And I think that's the best place to start is what defines fantasy. I see a lot of people say, but it's fantasy, you can do whatever you want.
And those people deserve to be tied to a stake.
Absolutely. Right. No, we're not going to define wrong. Wrong is purely a personal thing there. Apart from whether it's me or because obviously it's my stream. So if I say it's wrong, it is. It's as simple as that. Fantasy is not just whatever you want. Fantasy isn't just what's going on in your imagination. It is a genre. And it is a genre that has expectations. People say, oh, but science fiction is fantasy and horror is fantasy.
Can be.
If you take fantasy one way, it can be. Because a fantasy can be anything in your imagination. But when you're talking about a style of gaming, like D&D, for example, it doesn't mean the same thing. It means the fantasy genre. And fantasy genre has a number of expectations. One, an oldie feel. Now, which oldie period it feels like is completely up to the group, the DM, the players, whatever. You can have Arthurian, you can have Renaissance, you could go back to Roman mythology and that sort of stuff. All of those come under that oldie worldy feel for fantasy. Swords and sorcery often has that oldie worldy, largely has that oldie worldy feel, and swords and sorcery comes under the fantasy banner. Yes, Squirrel Hermit says here, fantasy mostly implies a medieval tone or setting. Now, the medieval can describe quite a wide period. I mean, what's the official definition of medieval? Anything from about 600 AD through to about 1500 AD.
You could argue one of the most fantastic periods of history is the Bronze Age. Everything looks totally weird and wonky, and it's not perfect. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love it, honestly, is that the medieval period looks believable and grounded, but if you look at Bronze Age stuff, you're like, all right, funny hats and imperfect weapons.
I think Omanal here, pre-industrial time. I think that's a good definition of the fantasy genre.
See, I'm going to disagree on that.
I'll challenge that. I think Star Wars is fantasy.
Yeah, Star Wars is fantasy. You can have high-tech fantasy.
Space wizards and laser swords.
No, because it's futuristic. I would argue sci-fi, and
but it's not science fiction.
But it's not science fiction.
It's science fantasy.
It's
fantasy, but science
strictly
fantasy.
in the fantasy genre.
That
I like my fantasy medieval and old timey, but I wouldn't exclusively say that has to be the definition, because there's plenty of things that qualify as fantasy that are high tech and futuristic. The movie Wizards, for example, the animated Bakshi film, that's a fantasy film, but that's post-apocalyptic. So there's elements of technology, but there's also elements of fantasy.
The Shadow and Bone setting is a colonial era, like 1800s fantasy setting.
Barry says Krull. Yeah.
Krull is weird. I mean, basically, you kind of have some science fiction going on in there, or is it just like very, magic science so far beyond us it appears to be magic, kind of a thing. But yeah,
I think Homanel's right there when he says sci-fi fantasy, but you are blending.
But it's still fantasy, right? And
so I would argue, if you say we're going to play a fantasy game, the first thing that will spring into your mind will be a medieval setting.
All right, well, maybe we just need to refine what we're defining then, because what sounds like what we're defining isn't fantasy, or isn't so much fantasy as a broad genre. We're defining like generic fantasy or baseline fantasy, just pure fantasy.
Yeah. I mean, anyway.
Classic fantasy, I guess, maybe almost. Yeah.
My main point was, though, that in this, in general, fantasy is a genre that assumes and does certain things.
Assumes the fantastic. It's right in the name.
So, I mean, what about Marvel, though? Would you class that as fantasy? Because it does
to a degree.
Fantastic.
To a degree. But it's also got its own contemporary kind of it's a superhero. Superhero is arguably its own genre, but that doesn't mean there aren't fantastical elements.
Mm-hmm. But I would say it's not fantasy genre.
No, I would tend to agree with that.
And it has fantastical elements.
Although the Thor films, particularly the first two, could be argued that they're fantasies rather than superhero films. So there's a lot of genre bending going on. I'm saying I don't think fantasy exclusively has to include ancient civilization. Though I tend to agree that's where my preference would lie when I hear fantasy, but I wouldn't make it exclusive.
I would say some of the most classic fantasy out there completely refutes the fact that it has to be ancient, because think about Vancian, Vance's stuff is a Earth so far in the future that it's degenerated to a fantastic world.
Mm-hmm.
The sort
Thundar,
of Shannara,
the barbarian, yeah.
The sort of Shannara series, the Shannara series, that's all so far in the future that the modern society has fallen and magic has risen, kind of a thing. So
they do tend to be fighting with swords and armor rather than laser guns and Kevlar in the fantasy genre.
Yeah, if you want to be overly specific, because Star Wars is still fighting with swords and has armor.
I mean, fast forward to 7:00. The sci-fi fantasy does not have to be ancient.
The Slayers in Krull are shooting laser beams everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So we have come to the conclusion here that defining fantasy it's a minefield. But I will still argue when people say the fantasy genre, the vast majority of people will automatically think of something like Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to argue that.
It's the first thing that will come to mind for the vast majority of people when you mention the fantasy genre for them. They'll be thinking of dragons and orcs and magic and swords and
wizards and heavy liches. Yes.
All that sort of thing. So that's the basic premise to start on. Now, there's a lot of people, and I've already seen Doof say this. I'm going to bring this one up from very, very early on. This was before the stream started. He posted this. D&D is in no way Tolkien-esque. It's not wrong to be inspired by it. And of course, Gygax himself, over and over again, tried to distance himself from Tolkien. But I'm going to bounce this back and say that Tolkien had a massive influence on D&D. Massive.
Yeah.
And that I don't believe that can be denied. You only need to look at the fact that when they first appeared, halflings were called hobbits. Type 6 demons were called balrogs when they first appeared. Treants were ents. In AD&D, you have 3 types of hobbit. Their names are derived from, like, you've got store, which are stout, and you
the Harefoots, the tall fellows.
Yeah, exactly. Tall fellows, aren't they fallow hides? And the hare feet are halflets. There we go. Those, and elves as well. High elves are Noldor elves. Sylvan elves are wood elves. And Sindar elves are grey elves. You've got those 3 distinct types of elves, 3 distinct types of hobbit. Even the ranger class was blatantly meant to combine fighting and tracking and a bit of magic use. Aragorn. The second level title for a ranger is
Strider.
Strider. Exactly.
Pure
Aragorn
coincidence.
is so not a second level ranger.
Has nothing to do with it. Pure coincidence.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no, it's a complete coincidence. So Gygax, Andrew says here, Gygax distanced himself, but had to for legal reasons. Right. Oh, there we go. Hold on with this one. He distanced himself verbally, but in terms of designing things in his game world and in his game, apart from the names he chose for some of these creatures, when hobbits became halflings and treants became ents became treants and so on, it was distancing in just name only. Because
isn't he even backing up, even with halflings? Like, he's still just backing off the proper name, because aren't they referred to as halflings in the books by the orcs?
Yeah.
So he's just like, okay, I won't call them hobbits, the copyrightable name, but I'll use halfling, a Scottish-derived word, and
Yeah, and when you look at the artwork in, for example, the Beckme books, Mensa's that lovely Elmo and Eastleigh artwork in the basic book, the halfling artwork in there, pudgy little men with fluffy, big fluffy feet and curly hair and pointy ears, and they are Tolkien hobbits. The halfling in AD&D, all the way up to late 2nd edition, apart from in specific other game worlds where they recreated them as Kenda and the cannibal halflings in Dark Sun, in standard D&D, right up until 3rd edition, 3rd edition changed them, they were blatantly Tolkien hobbits throughout. The name had just been changed to make them sound different.
The name had been changed to protect the innocent.
Precisely. So, even if the mechanics in the game don't back up Tolkien as such, the flavor that is there in the books, the design of the classes, the name, obviously, as we mentioned, the level titles, there's more than a small nod to Tolkien in there. In fact, there's a great big nod. And when Gygax was trying to distance himself, I don't think he was being entirely straight about it. Do either of you two have anything to add to my rant? If it was a rant, really.
Not really. I mean, I think he absolutely distanced himself officially just for legal reasons, but he kept what he could because he wanted something that was familiar to the readers of the various genres, the different fantasies. It wasn't just Tolkien, though.
Yeah, I think. He, even though he may not have been a fan of Tolkien, he included it because it's part of what people would expect.
Yeah.
If he was going to put a game out there that was fantasy, he was going to have to include a wide enough and popular enough interpretation of fantasy, and one of the biggest ones at the time was going to be Tolkien, to really make it register. if he was to avoid it because he didn't particularly like Tolkien, first of all, that's just bad design. Ignoring something and not including it because you have a personal issue with it, that's just, especially if you're designing product, you kind of have to put those aside sometimes. But people would have looked at it and gone, okay, well, where are the halflings? Where are the elves? What kind of fantasy is this?
Mm-hmm. That's because because what springs to first people's when you say fantasy game in most people's minds, what did I say about 5-10 minutes ago? What springs to mind straight away? Elves, dwarves, halflings, dragons. Because so many people have got an early fantasy grounding in things like The Hobbit, for example. How many of us read The Hobbit before we were in long trousers? I did. I was 8-9 years old. You didn't?
Nope, because every adult in my life spewed that stuff like every adult in my life was a complete Tolkien head, and so they had all the posters, they had all the books.
So you already had it ingrained in you, though.
Exactly. And so like the first Tolkien I ever encountered was the Rankin and Bass animated feature, which I loved as a kid. But getting through Tolkien's prose has always been a problem for me because I'm like, all right, I know what's happening. I can't read through this. But yeah, so I'm an exception. I really haven't. I've not exhaustively read his work.
But still, you were exposed to the tropes.
I couldn't help it. I mean, every time I go over to some friend of my parents' house, they're on the walls, on the shelves, on the commemorative plate, whatever, the tapestry on the wall.
So now we've categorically, I think was it Slan who posted something up here? I've got an issue of Dragon where he states Tolkien didn't have that big an influence on the game after listing a long list of similarities.
Yeah. I half of me wonders if those later tune changes were just him trying to distance himself for copyright reasons. It's like, look, no, it absolutely wasn't. No, this is my official.
My elves aren't immortal. They're not 6 feet tall.
My official stance is no, it wasn't. Even though I'm lying through my teeth.
Yeah. So,
I mean, and we see that with corporations all the time. I mean, they flat out, or even in businesses all the time, they flat out do something, and that they did it, but their official, nope, didn't do it. It's like having a 4-year-old sitting there with a face full of cookie. Did you get in the cookie jar? No, never.
You come home from work and the dog's destroyed a cushion. You just sat there completely innocently with pieces of cushion all over
exactly.
All over the room. I'm innocent.
Oh God, the Vanilla Ice baby with Under Pressure. I even saw him sit there in an interview and try and defend it because he has got a little hi-hat hit in the middle of the offending piece of music, and he's like, "See, it's totally different." That little, I'm like, "No, dude." One does not add a in the middle and completely get it.
Yes, Kabuki. I have heard this Kabuki Kid. Supposedly he did incorporate it in there, but he then went on to say that it wasn't based on Tolkien.
Well, and that's kind of what I was saying before. I mean, it's in there because you'd be dumb not to. If you're going to try and create a mass appeal product, I mean, can you imagine how poorly D&D probably would have been received if it would have come out and he's like, it's just based on Jack Vance and Robert E. Howard, and a little bit of Burroughs in there to boot, but no Tolkien, none of that stuff.
So now we've categorically, as far as I'm concerned, it is proven that you say the word fantasy and most people think of Tolkien. You say the word fantasy and most people think of that era, that genre of a medieval Europe with swords and
I will agree
male
with you on
armor.
that. That
Yeah.
that is what comes to most people's minds. I don't necessarily feel that that's a sum total definition, but I mean it isn't. But I mean, but
But
definitely
we can agree that's what it evokes.
exactly.
Yes. And I will say now, because it invokes that sort of feeling in my mind, when I encounter games that do things differently, that are meant to be generic fantasy, I find them awkward. It's fine if a game, for example, Conan, which is swords and sorcery, which is a genre, a branch of fantasy. The game is specifically designed to emulate the Conan world. And if you play that game, you know you're playing in the Conan world with all the different things associated with it.
Yeah.
But a lot of the games we play market themselves as pretty much generic fantasy. So when I see aspects of the game moving away from what I'm comfortable with, which is the Tolkien-esque fantasy, I find it awkward. I will admit that now. Which leads me on to, I think, which is the main body of tonight's discussion. And it's our views on fantasy.
You asked for it.
What makes good fantasy? What we don't like, what we do like, what we demand in our fantasy worlds, and what we absolutely detest in our fantasy worlds. And I think we should pretty much go round and come up with one thing and discuss it and keep going until we're exhausted.
You start.
And some me start.
Yeah.
Your channel.
Okay. Okay. Right.
Although before you start, I just want to address Kabuki Kid's message here. You see RPG and everyone thinks of D&D. Well, it's because there are no other games other than D&D. Everybody knows that. It's D&D or bust.
All
my
games
mates,
are
my
D&D.
my mates used to describe Friday nights as D&D night when we've been playing Call of Cthulhu for a year. Who's coming to D&D tonight?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
It was very much a descriptor back in the day. You know, we doing D&D this weekend. Yeah, what do we play? It's almost like saying Coke in the South. What kind of Coke do you want? What kind of D&D do you want? You want top secret? Do you want?
Yep. Want Paranoia? Do you want Star Wars? Yeah, we'll do Star Wars D&D tonight, or whatever. Okay, my radical views. Are these radical? Okay. I'm going to say straight away that I believe classical fantasy tropes are an opportunity and not a restriction.
Classical fantasy tropes are an opportunity, opportunity and not a restriction.
Yes.
Yes. I don't think there's much of an argument there.
Is that not a radical view at all?
No.
No. Any idea is an opportunity. You use or not use to your heart's content.
Well,
limited palettes are useful.
If you were to say that to an 18-year-old on the D&D subreddit, do you think that statement would be upvoted or downvoted?
Well, 18-year-olds are idiots. I remember. I was once.
Well, there you go. There we go.
It depends on what board you're on, too.
Yeah, I think it would be seen as being a pretty heretical opinion in quite a lot of gaming groups nowadays. But I'm going to expand that a little bit because my opinion is a lot. Yes, thank you, Michael. A lot of people try and play against type. It's become it's become boring. The amount of people that try and play against type while claiming playing the tropes is what's boring. So much so that it's almost refreshing now, I find, when someone wants to play an ale swilling, gold hoarding dwarf who hits things with hammers. But I believe playing into those stereotypes that make people visualize the race you're playing, I think that enhances the game because it allows people to share a common image of what's going on, a common image of the world, rather than confusing the thoughts that are in people's heads. I mean, what is more engaging out of these two? A dwarf going into a bar and when being offered ale saying, "No, I'm teetotal," or a dwarf going into a bar and discussing with the other dwarfs what the best brand of beer is in lengthy, pedantic, anal detail. I think the latter, personally.
I think your example is a little loaded, but I understand what you're saying. Because I mean, you're assuming that the teetotaler dwarf is just going to stop at that and not play anything else about his character. You know,
Yeah,
whereas you're ascribing quite a bit more effort to your dwarf who's going in and discussing the ale as opposed to the teetotaler.
The teetotaler as well is generating narrative conflict because he's now opposing and creating discussions like why wouldn't you drink? Come on, we'd give him a fine ale, and it's like no, I'm refraining. Why would you do that? And then espouses beliefs, and you create that conflict and interaction. Whereas just going along with the flow, it's all right. Well, okay, you all order drinks. Okay, what's next?
Because to back up your dwarf going in there and drinking example, the guy who's going to play the standard dwarf could just simply say, "I'm going into the inn and drinking ale," and not engage in any other RP, just as much as your teetotaler can go and say, "I'm abstaining," and then not engage in any other role play. Equal examples being equal. Yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna add another person to the stream. Hello, Joe the lawyer.
Hello, Asmodeus.
Hey guys.
Hello. Right. My comeback to your point. You're right.
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But my comeback to your point there, Alfbait, is okay. This teetotal dwarf is a member of the party, right?
Awesome.
Yeah. So the amount of exposure that what's the amount of exposure the party members get in the game compared to what each NPC gets in the game? The party members get the spotlight.
Okay.
So if you have a character who's if your player characters continually push the idea that this dwarf is teetotal, which will happen in every bar they go into, it'll be like, "Have an ale." "No, I'm teetotal." It after the second or third bar, it ceases to become a particularly interesting trait, and because the party members are front and center in the game, it normalizes that difference. So dwarves, in my opinion, that causes dwarves in general to lose that aspect of their flavor by being brought up almost too often if it's every time they go into a bar. Do you get what I'm getting at?
I see what you're getting at, but I still feel like the example is far too isolated in its.
I could come up with better examples.
Because I mean, you're assuming in that case. I mean, so let's say that is the only representation of a dwarf in the campaign. Well, then what's wrong with your DM, and why aren't there more dwarves in the campaign? Or why?
But none of those dwarves are going to have the same level of exposure as the player character.
No, but am I supposed to then assume that every fighter in the campaign world is just like the one human fighter, or that every elf is just like the one human one elf, or I mean, you were talking about player characters. So if a player character is an individual and often a standout character, then it doesn't matter what he represents because he's always going to be a one-off example. He's not going to be characteristic. I think
my point here is that if you're constantly playing against type, if you constantly and if the whole group do that, play against type, then suddenly those flavorful tropes that give the races their individuality get lost over time. If the whole group start doing it.
Yeah, but you have to consider the individual player too. And, a good player can take a quote unquote boring idea and bring it to life, whereas a really cruddy player can take the most exciting concept and drive it into the ground. True. So it really does boil down to the individual expression. And I mean, personally, I'm not going to control what the players choose to do. It's like if they want to try to go against type and, subvert the tropes, and by all means, they'll succeed or fail on their own merit.
I think what it comes down to too is the setting. And at least in my games, the setting always trumps everything else, right? And beyond the rules. So when you're looking at dwarves in the setting, and if there's a dwarf who wants to worship an elven god, for example, and he wants to be a cleric of an elven god, it's like, all right, but there will be in-game consequences. Do whatever the hell you want, right? Play it however you want to play it, but it's going to be freaking weird. It's not everything is accepted.
Those in-game consequences are the reason to do that, because you want to generate that story and that interest and that narrative path.
Mm-hmm. It's like what Sean was saying about going back to the teetotaler, that in that example, that dwarf who doesn't like ale and is, very much, maybe more puritanical than the rest of the dwarves, is going to run into conflict when he runs into other dwarves. It's at least going to generate some suspicion.
Ostracized.
It's definitely going to have some. I mean, even if it's not ostracized, it's still going to be a point of role play, and it's going to be something that's going to come up, and there will be consequences. Whether they're catastrophic or not is another thing. But
it depends on the offense, right? I mean, well, you guys, I was catching the last 15 minutes before, and I guess my quick 1-minute summary of what, my thought on what you were talking about in terms of the types. I grew up with Tolkien like you guys did, and, Lord of the Rings and Conan books and all that stuff, all the stuff in Appendix N, right? A lot of it in Appendix N. And so that's my foundation. And because of that, I can't look at books featuring weird ass classes and races that don't fit the paradigm of what I expect D&D to be like. And it got to a certain extent where I was running a group at a game store that was one woman who was in her 60s, everybody else was in their young 20s. It was only a few years ago for me. I'm in my late 40s then. And they just didn't understand where I was coming from on a lot of things. So I gave an out-of-game XP. I say, watch these 8 or 10 movies. It was Conan the Barbarian. It was Tombstone. Even though Tombstone's not D&D, I wanted them to get a feel for it. And I gave them a couple hundred XP for every movie they watched. Just so they could get in the right mindset to play in my game. Because they're playing furry creatures with cat people and bird people, and like, the hell is this crap? And half giants, and it's just like, it didn't make any sense to me. So I wanted them to get into my mindset,
I mean, so me in 1986, so we were playing, weird, crazy characters and creatures in my groups back in the day.
Yeah, I never did.
I never did either.
I remember we had one party that was a centaur, a lizard man, a 3-creen, a siren, and that was it.
I'm not a fan of the creature cantina approach myself.
But that was the whole point of that campaign, though, is to play weird, crazy characters. But I'm just saying, that that can be a type of D&D and a type of fantasy in and of itself.
True.
There's a lot of fantasy novel worlds that are like that.
Yeah. Nothing I've ever read or grew up with, though. So my expectations are very different.
Sorry, finish your thought.
Go ahead. I was just saying, too, in terms of the reality of, I think what's missing in D&D, I think, Geek, you were talking about this a little bit. What is it based on? It's first and foremost, it's based in military wargaming strategy, miniatures and things like that. And so I look at D&D as a medieval war game with a magic overlay, but basically it is 1-on-1 instead of 100-on-100. That's, what I mean? And the further we've gotten away from that simulationist verisimilitude of the whole thing, the further away the D&D game seems from my expectations and what I like.
So, but we can peel it back further because it was actually based on a Napoleonic game. So
Brownstein.
In terms of the multiple races, I'm generally not a fan of allowing the multiple options, but of course, in the game world, there are tons of races, whether or not the players can play them. The key thing that makes or breaks it, if you're allowing multiple player races, is the racism, is the acceptance, consequences. Like somebody wants to be a dragonborn. Great. Well, they're walking around. They're a humanoid dragon. You think you're going to walk into a human village and just be accepted?
Oh yeah, even in our party of weirdness, I forgot there was one other character in there because it was all weird, crazy characters except for the elf. And 3 Kreen like to eat elf flesh, and so the 3 Kreen, the player went so far as to start bringing dehydrated apples to games and calling them shriveled up elf ears, and he would sit there and look at the 3 Kreen at the elf player and just go. Slow chew his dehydrated apple ears at the guy just to make him feel uncomfortable.
But that's fun.
Exactly. So talking about that racism and consequences in the universe, even within the party, we had that because what is that? Oh, that's an elf cake. What do you mean it's an elf cake? It's made out of elves. Where did you get it? Oh, well, I go out into the woods at night and
I mean, there's an aspect of that, and where the D&D game was. I mean, like the foundation of it. Here, I'll show you this screen. Geek, I don't know if you want to share it. Let me just make sure nothing else is showing here that gives away anything about me. There you go. I mean, we all seen this from back in the day. It was baked into the game.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the way it was. Racial preferences. Some people hate
use that
it.
religiously. They've had the preferred marker for when they're negotiating with people. They've got a human paladin in the group, and he has a charisma of 18. And when it comes up, he's always blown away at just how well other humans react to him. As he's got a static plus 50 modifier or 55, and it's like he can never get a truly hostile response unless he does something really off the wall. So it's wonderful. You got to use those. Meanwhile, the half orc he elicits a hostile response. He opens his mouth to order a beer.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if an elf walks through the city of Waterdeep or wherever you're playing your game, a dark elf does. It's a whole different reaction than what the high elf does, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. It's built in,
But racism is bad, folks. So we're not allowed to include it in our games.
That goes back to the reality of the world. I mean, nobody wants to create a shitty situation like we deal with in real life, but we want some level of immersion, right?
Yeah, we want some grounding.
Yeah, it has to feel real to us. Not all rainbows and butterflies, or else who the hell be casting fireballs at?
Something I like is, I mean, obviously, because in my head, as I've said a number of times in the stream already, fantasy immediately gives me an image of a medieval style world. I try and think about what I know about medieval style worlds, where few people will have ventured more than 10 miles away from their home. There will be superstitions, fears, often irrational fears. In fact, most of them are highly irrational, but those will exist. Those will exist, and trust will be hard earned if you are deemed an outsider. So it takes me away from my natural image of a fantasy world when I see images and see groups where there's 6 players all playing widely different races and getting on as if none of it matters. And as people have said, playing them as skin suits for the stats.
Humans in funny hats.
Yes.
It's a flavor of fantasy. It's a style of play, and people like it.
People do like it. Yeah. And I mean, is it a radical view for me to spout nowadays when I say I don't?
No, and it's you're as entitled to like what you like as anybody else is. That's I guess I just get really tired nowadays of people bagging on people for actually enjoying something.
Yeah.
What you enjoy is never going to be a question, but is it still fantasy? Yes, it is still fantasy.
and I agree with you on that front. I think the fatigue comes from the reverse. Courtesy is not there. You play an old school style game when it's got that verisimilitude, it's got the darker elements, and suddenly you're a bad person.
Yeah, that's people though, and I don't have I try not to like return or feedback on that kind of negative response. I spent far too much time getting butthurt and cranky about that myself, and just realized that was not good for me, nor was it good for. It's not going to do me a damn bit of good trying to convince people otherwise. If I just come across as the grumpy old beardy dude, if I want them to like the games that I like and play the games I like, it's definitely not going to help to beat them over the head with a copy of the original DMG.
Although you could, and it would withstand the blow because that DMG.
Mine's gone into
mine's gone
into a muddy ditch and it's still fine. So,
who was that guy who was telling people that if you don't play 5th edition, you're a horrible person? It was one of the YouTubers.
Far too many people.
Yeah,
I don't know. There was a guy who was going around. I don't.
Jay Scott Garibay.
Is that him? Okay,
that's it. Yes. Yeah.
Well,
don't check his channel out unless you really have a predilection for inflicting weirdness on yourself.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've got a friend who seems to have like the worst luck drawing fire from noisy, angry demographics. Let's just say, and I don't know how he draws their fire because I know him and he's not the guy they think he is. And I'm like. And it's funny because it's like I'm like, how are you getting that? Especially, and then you have I've mentioned before, my kids are definitely newer folk, right? They're of the younger generation. They don't have that baggage. Yeah.
It's all how you're raised in your environment. What you're exposed to.
Well, what's funny is like, all right. So I don't want to get into it too much. Just to qualify, both my kids are queer. Right out the way, right? However, I have heard both of them say time and time again, "Oh my God, those queer people," because they realize that there are extremes in all camps, and so in that regard, they're just like, just because somebody's got a rainbow flag doesn't mean they're necessarily right, and that's just their perspective.
The hell did I just walk into?
Me talking about my queer kids and how their outlook on gaming is and stuff is just like, hey, look, yes, I'm queer, but there's a buddy of mine keeps getting cornered for not having queer characters in his games, for example, and he's like, well, could you tell if there were? It's not like we're The Sims and we walk around with a giant glowing Q over our head just because we're queer, right? Anyways, but I didn't want to go too far into it. But as an example of modern audiences and stuff like that, because that's a big one that comes up. And my kids don't have that attitude, even though they are within that community. So it's not a universal feeling.
It's extremes everywhere. I think that just going back to the other topic there, the 5K there said. The K5K. Other people have got all the fun playing Dragonborn Tieflings and Orcs all they wish, just not at my table. They're not appropriate for the setting. And what I've done is I've co-opted it. I'm like, all right, you got the name of Dragonborn Tiefling, whatever. I changed it around. I'm like, you want to play a kind of a dragon person? I've changed it and everything about it and made it a different, not just a playable class, but a cultural thing within the setting. And then if you want to play it, they're maybe tougher characters, but they're also they have more restrictions due to how they will be taken in society, right? And so it's that sort of thing. I just made them my own essentially, and so
I had a consequences. I had a campaign where I flat out I was just not gonna have Dragonborn in that campaign setting, and then it was a game I was doing for a bunch of teenagers, like 10 of them. It's 5th edition game. One of them came in and he absolutely wanted to play a Dragonborn barbarian. And I'm like, oh man, this is his first time playing D&D. so I kind of didn't let the Wookiee win, right?
Yeah.
Get him into the game, then we can talk about specifics, right? Talk about refining that idea. But then he's like, what about this place on your map? It's called the Dragon Coast. I'm like, okay. He's like, I want my character to be from there. And he's like, I'm like, and you're a barbarian. And so next thing you know, between this collaboration between me and this kid coming in, my campaign world now had a new thing in it than it ever had before. And that was, there used to be a dragon kingdom where there were dragon people, and they were once a mighty empire, and now they're all a bunch of barbarians scrabbling out an existence in the remnant of their old world. So, I mean, letting that new idea in, the whole game was like, I'm like, you're going to use the, I was like elf, dwarf, blah, 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 and this one guy wanted to play this Dragonborn. But like you're saying, you just kind of own it and make it your own, right? Or like tieflings, one of my kids wanted to play a tiefling. I'm like, okay, this setting doesn't really have tieflings as a race. If you want to play a tiefling, you're definitely going to be an outsider. People are going to look at you funny because you got the devil in you, right?
Yeah, quite literally.
And my kid's like, that sounds cool. All right.
Oh, speaking Asmodeus, it is cool, really.
So the conversation has gone from my radical view that playing racial stereotypes in the game enhances the game, to my second one on here, which is I hate people imposing modern societal attitudes in a fantasy world because a fantasy world is medieval.
My hero.
Yeah, amen to that, dude.
So that's two of my topics used. Two of my topics used up, and we've hammered them pretty well. And it seems to be that us all being grognardy old gits, it doesn't seem to be too radical.
I'm all for
I
players
just speak French.
as their characters trying to evoke societal change in the game world. That'll lead to consequences and conflict. I am not for a player sitting at the table demanding that their sensitivities be catered to. That's
I'm working on my big campaign right now, my for all my live streams and everything like that. And one of the key components in the world is who and where slavery is happening. And I had someone say to me, that's a really sensitive topic. Are you going to put a trigger warning in the book? I went, no, I'm not going to put a trigger warning in the book because I don't know any slaves. Therefore, I'm not worried about triggering anyone. And it's just silly to me. Like,
you got to have a Darth Vader, right? I mean, there's got to be a bad guy and bad stuff in a campaign setting because you have to have conflict.
Good and evil.
And so I people always want to talk about how Dark Sun's never going to get made by WotC, and they're right. WotC will never remake Dark Sun, and they always talk about it because it's got slavery and eugenics and all. I'm like, yes, and none of that is actually presented in the game as a good thing. It's all stuff to reel against, and you're all the fallout of the universe.
But that's the problem, Elf. It's this mentality that addressing something, and even if you address it in the way it should be addressed, in that this is evil and should, if your characters want to go against it and free the world from slavery, my God, have a good time. It's going to be a great campaign with lots of dead people ultimately, but it'll be an amazing campaign. Yeah. But to have
I am Spartacus.
Exactly, or I'm Carl Cullen from the Sleeping Dragon.
We can go back to classic literature. How often was Conan beating the crap out of slavers and I will be no slave?
And how many times was Conan put in chains? The point is that
it's a great. It's a thing to do to fight against.
Yeah. I don't want my fantasy games to be, as I love to refer to it, Fantasy Seattle doing yet another version of Ocean's fucking 11, which is all that D&D has become now. Mm-hmm. It's become heist adventure after heist adventure after heist adventure, all set in that beautiful version of Fantasy Seattle, Waterdeep. It's like, I'm done. Sorry, that's my rant there, Young.
So here's a noodle baker for your players.
From Seattle,
have a lawful good kingdom that condones slavery, and you have the chaotic evil barbarians who are fighting the slavery, and watch them try to figure out where their allegiance lie.
You decided all of Seattle's mind just went insane. Yeah, right there.
But like Sean, you're right. That's absolutely logical. The lawful good kingdom in a world where slavery exists would believe under law slaves are a good thing, and the chaotic barbarian who believes in individuality and fierceness would think slavery is a bad thing, even if they're evil.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And they might even
watch the heads
slaves.
explode.
They might even have slaves of their own, because how often do you see that in actual history? culture A opposes actual like institutionalized slavery while
Mhm.
meanwhile having a slave at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they don't
He's
call
not a
it
slave. He's free to leave anytime. He's
a
not going to survive.
bondsman.
All
He's
he
a
has to do is pick up that
bondsman.
axe and fight his way out of the building, and he's good to go.
I guess but he's not an actual slave. He can work his way up. It's really fucking hard, but he can work his way up.
Well, the Romans could, right? Like there was a whole thing in Rome where you could work off your slavery.
Well, there's even
You could-
accounts of slaves just digging being slaves too, because they had different levels of slave. It's like I live in a mansion. I'm eating really good food because while I am a slave, my job is basically executive assistant to whoever. You know?
I mean, obviously, to everyone in chat, we are not arguing that slavery.
Yeah.
Is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But
We're arguing it as a thematic element.
The way I could perceive it being in a lawful good society is, for example, if you are caught, if you commit what would potentially be a capital offence, it might be considered to be a good thing to force you to work off your debt to society as a slave, to try and make you contribute towards society and atone for your bad deeds.
We do it today. It's called community service.
Exactly.
And didn't
work
Rome
release.
have something like that where debtors
Yes, they
could
did.
voluntarily go into slavery to work off their debt?
Yes, they did. Yes.
America had indentured servants, right? Same thing.
Yeah,
Europe had indentured servants too. I mean, so.
I'm sure Canada did at some point. I don't know.
Oh yeah. Keep in mind, at a certain point, we were all just the same folks. So then a border was made. And some of us
lawful
broke
good
free.
A lawful good nation would totally use slaves, and that's what people are equating them. Our modern view of slavery bad with how ancient societies would view it. Now, a lawful good society attacked by a neighboring enemy, they take their prisoners, and it's like, well, it's merciful to give them work and give them life rather than put them to the sword. So we are bettering them. But they are our enemies, so they are a slave. That could be one justification easily.
So let's not to be a dick about it, but let's move off the hot button topic of slavery, and maybe move on to a less hot button but equally interesting topic: things like arranged marriages.
Slavery.
In the fantasy world, if you're doing a medieval society, the concept of marriage for love should be fairly in the books and the plays and the songs, but most people marry out of convenience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I need children to work my farm, or I need to continue my noble land, and I want to bring your land and my land together, and we'll have more land as a result of doing this marriage.
Mm-hmm.
My dad needs your dad's cash.
Yeah, or I need that army to go fight that asshole, so I got to marry that buck-toothed, ugly son of his. You know what I mean, or whatever the case may be, right?
Yep. He was 40 years older.
Yeah. So again, modern ideas. I think it's going to be hard to ever play a game where you're not going to have modern ideals creep in, because we're modern people, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just going to happen.
I mean, do you have glass in your D&D buildings?
You know. Do you have beer? Not ale, beer. It's a different beast. But the point is that how much policing of that is necessary, right? Like it's going to speak to the buy-in of your players.
I'm just going to be a pedant here.
Go for it.
Here in Britain, ale, when we say beer, we think ale or bitter being first.
Mm-hmm.
What you call beer, we call lager.
So I think when we think beer, we think Pilsner for the most part.
No,
I think that's what we're thinking here. Well, okay, the British are snotty about beer. We know. We're aware. You visit our country often. We know.
We would think, when you say going out for a pint of beer, most of us would initially think of a darker beer, like an ale or something.
I'm referring to the carbonation.
Right.
Like, I've had people in games go, well, I'm going to shake up my beer and have it explode in his face. And I'm like, it does that. No. It doesn't exist. No. So that's what I'm referring to. Sorry.
It's interesting.
Okay. Does anyone? All right. So we've hit on some of my what I would have thought could possibly, in some circles, be classed as radical views that we could argue about. Do any of you have radical views of things that you must have or mustn't have in your fantasy?
I got something that I've been tossing around for about 15 years, and nobody seems to get my point when I make this, right? Since it goes back to what I said before, with D&D being basically Middle Ages, throw on top of that magic, right? And so we have all the tropes of Middle Ages. We have arms and weapons and armor and castles and high, big, tall walls and this and that, right? But I contend that in a world with magic, in a world with invisible magic users, with fireballs and all the power they have, that's the equivalent of having B-1 bombers in your world. Castles as we know them from the actual Middle Ages would not exist.
Oh yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
So they'd be different.
It'd be very different.
There's a whole Dragon magazine article written on that, actually talking about how they should be. But you have flying dragons in your world.
Yeah.
Why are all your walls still without roofs?
Exactly.
Exactly. Why don't you have giant spikes sticking out of everything upwards?
Everything should be hoardings with waterproof skins on the top.
Oh god, yeah.
Yep.
That's an absolutely fair point, but it also depends on the rarity of such creatures too. Like if everybody's a wizard, like in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, then yeah. Whereas if you're going by the demographics of say 1st edition, where only 1 in every 100 people is adventuring class, and then you've got further like 1% of those are wizards, then wizards are so uncommon, especially the ones who can fling fireballs.
Ignore the wizard.
And exactly, what percentage of them are going to make it to the level, survive long enough to learn a fireball spell,
or have high enough intelligence to be able to cast those level spells?
Yeah, true, exactly. Right? So demographics is important for that consideration. It really depends on your specific world.
However, even if you take the wizards out of the equation, the base D&D world is so full of monsters and things that definitely challenge conventional construction methods that it would still affect how things are built.
Okay.
You've got giants, you've got dragons, you've got griffins, you've got giant eagles, even mundane critters like giant beetles.
Most of these things live underground, though. You find
here's a question:
a giant eagle lives underground?
They're not generally bad. They're not generally bad.
I know, but
they live in caves. Okay, but here's a question, and I forget because I haven't read it in 25 years easily. In Two Towers, the book, how does Saruman breach the walls at Helm's Deep? Because I know in the Bashki animated film, he sends basically a fireball from Isengard. And in the Peter Jackson movie, he has him put a bomb underneath in the culvert.
Gunpowder and Peter Jackson,
Because Peter Jackson understood, if I show Saruman sending a fireball from Isengard, the audience is going to go, why doesn't he do 5 more of those?
Yeah.
So I got to do something finite.
I actually don't know. I haven't read it
and I can't remember.
Years.
No, I read it 3 years ago, reread it 3 years ago, and I can't remember.
My brother.
Well, here we are.
Chime in. He's listening here. He knows this shit backwards and forwards.
AB says a blasting charge. Anyone who's read Two Towers recently? Is that
I mean,
right?
it's very possible that Tolkien, in his whole industrialization of the orcs, had them have gunpowder.
Yeah.
His whole thing was basically, Saruman and all of them were supposed to be anti-nature, and that would be very anti-nature. The ability to for the common man to do so much devastation.
I got the book back on the shelf behind me.
Could you read it real quick for us?
At least 8 feet away.
Just a 1,000-page book. Yeah,
skim.
Just come on, man. Come on. The devilry of Saruman is how it's referred to.
The devilry?
Yeah.
All right. Give me a chapter.
The fire of Orthanc was used by Saruman's army of Uruk-hai and Dunlingdons to blast a culvert to bring down the large fortifications. It was referred to as a blasting fire, as someone said in the chat, when Aragorn described it to Theoden. The exact nature of the devilry, capitalized, of Saruman is unknown.
Oh, all right.
So open to interpretation.
Magic.
Yes. Magic.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But I mean, that's you ask for something controversial, different. That's what I've been arguing forever. But at the same time, I like playing D&D in the Middle Ages with magic, so I'm not going to change castles because I like castles.
Mhm.
So
Well,
Yeah,
at
I
what point
overlook
are you-
that.
If you're really going
At
to
what
play the
point are you
Middle
playing
Ages, you could have
Skyrim's-
bombs and guns.
For sure.
Yeah.
But the thing is if you start getting down that road, Joe, and this is the point I want to make. At what point are you now playing Talismantla or Skyrims of Jorun or Empire of the Petal
Oh,
Throne,
yeah.
where
Yeah.
you've gone so far away from the
Yeah.
world we know to respond to all of these questions, you're making something unrecognizable.
It's
Yeah.
a slippery slope too, because then you
Yeah.
start wondering about like, okay, well, how do dragons actually fly, and how is it that giants don't crumple under the physics of their own weight? And because we're getting too realistic. You're exactly.
How
You
do
want it to
giant
still look like
spiders
castles and
exist?
stuff.
How
Yeah,
could a gnome have
exactly.
1800
The atmosphere doesn't have enough oxygen for arthropods of that size.
Well, the answer, we figured it out. We just say the devilry of Saruman and move on.
Forever.
Everything is the devilry of Saruman.
That
Yeah,
son of
yeah.
a bitch with his devilry.
And as the stand-in for Saruman, I guess you could say the devilry of the DM, right?
Yeah.
We're the ultimate antagonist in this, so devilry of the DM. God, Middle Ages had gunpowder. Yeah, it did later in Middle Ages. but
Yes,
yeah,
it
Yeah.
did. I'm actually
Yeah,
as early as like the 1400s, something like that.
14, yeah.
13, 14.
Yeah, they had early hand firearms were incredibly inaccurate, but if you put a line of 400 of them, they didn't need to aim. It was just
So
like
that's called the American Civil War before riflings, or
yeah.
that's that's how that works.
It's probably part of the problem the Civil War was so bad is they had rifles. They had rifling, and they were still fighting in old tactics with modern firearms.
Didn't rifling come in later in the war? I forget.
Not in the North.
Not in the North. No, the North, and the North was where they got the cartridge round from as well, which really
Yeah,
changed the whole
but you're
thing.
trying to fight with Napoleonic tactics
Exactly.
with more accurate guns, so the death count goes way up.
Yeah.
And then the
But this is the
Gatling
thing,
was
the
invented.
Chinese,
Yeah.
the Chinese had firearms. The Chinese had rockets that they would send against their enemies, like literally
Yeah.
just like a line of them, light the fuse, and off you go. So at some point, you have to decide in your fantasy: it has gunpowder, it does not have gunpowder. Make a choice, go in a direction, commit to it.
Yeah.
I personally would allow, if you get to a level where you have a castle, I would allow you to put cannons and things on the castle. But I would
I
not.
restrict it to dwarves. I only allow dwarves in my setting to have firearms because it's their new secret that they've invented after they
I
lost
would not
the
allow them to
humans.
use firearms in individual combat because they
Oh no! That's
utterly
like saying
inaccurate.
owning a private jet. You don't. Your average random dwarf doesn't have a rifle. No.
My
Yeah.
dwarves
Go attack
have
that dwarf hold and see how many cannons are staring down the mouth of you.
Oh yeah.
my dwarves use rune magic to create firearms.
Yeah.
They
That's
just use a thunder rune that when the hammer strikes it, it creates a thunder boom and fires up a solid metal crossbow bolt. Basically,
That's a cool goddamn idea, man. I like that.
Yeah.
I really like that.
they got the
Um,
rune of
yoink.
thunder. Just go ahead, and then
Yeah.
because they're dwarves, the barrel is probably like 3 times as thick as it needs to be because
Oh, yeah, yeah,
doubles
yeah.
the haft of an axe.
Yep.
And so they just got an axe blade hanging off the bottom of it. So
Mhm.
when they close into melee, they're like bonk.
And it's like intricately carved to look like a dragon's head or something. You know.
Oh, yeah.
Rune locks.
That's very
Rune lock. I love it.
And we now have
Modern
a full
problems
complement of
require-
6.
Modern solutions. But
We now have a full complement of 6.
Oh, we did.
Nope. Yep.
I mean, I remember once having
Oh,
a
hey,
player
oh.
character in my campaign who was an archer who wanted to invent the compound bow in D&D. I'm like, all right, if you can find the artificer in your world, he called it
Hello,
a
I'm an
bowl.
Hello, I just heard you talking about firearms, and I went, I don't have any problems with if you look at how ineffective actual firearms are. I mean, they're great for armor piercing, but they're horrible for actual rate of fire. You shoot it once and you're done, or you carry multiple muskets or things like that.
Oh yeah, I mean they're horrible adventuring gear. I mean everybody's like, I love it when people are like firearms are going to ruin D&D. No, they're not.
No, they're not. Have you seen Brotherhood of the Wolf?
Yes, exactly.
That's the best example. When Manny and j'oublie son nom, I forget his name, Gelsek, I can't remember his name. When they go out to get their revenge, he's got like 8 guns on him. You know
Whatever
what
his
I mean?
name is, I always sounded like Balzac.
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 It's that kind of Chevalier Balzac. I can't remember.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I can't be.
The point is, he's got 8 guns. So he's like,
there's a
shoots one,
reason why
drops it, shoots
supposedly
another,
Blackbeard carried 6 pistols looped around his neck.
Well, but I mean, when you start looking at it, a lot of it to me is, and to be fair, when we're talking about fantasy, Warhammer Fantasy is a perfect example of where firearms work well in the system. And I said, okay, that's a Renaissance aspect. That said, if anyone watched some of the old Shogun, where they talk specifically about why would I want to learn firearms? Well, because firearms are easy to train. That's the whole reason you get firearms. And
Firearms are crossbow plus.
Firearms take 5 to 7 years. I'm sorry, a crossbow takes 5 to 7 years. Not crossbow. A longbow takes 5 to 7 years of training. A firearm takes 2 to 4 weeks to get someone to actually use muskets.
That's why crossbows became popular too. It's because they were, you could hand it to anybody and teach them how to use it. So.
Well, and that's exactly the point. Now, is that absolutely represented in games? Not really, because they'll be like, well, you get to fire every other round. Well, that's great if you're using 1 minute rounds. If you're using 10-second rounds, then maybe if you were an expert at shooting, it's like, oh, look at you. You get to do this so often. I think that's you have to play the limitations up for the weapons.
Well, it depends on the size of the crossbow, though, right? If it's a heavy crossbow, absolutely, foot in the stirrup and the crank.
Yep.
If it's a medium level crossbow, you got the hook grab to pull the rope back with the crank. You could fire every other round.
Well,
the heavy crossbow.
I'm saying, but an actual firearm.
Oh,
and that's assuming you didn't lose your windlass. Where's your windlass? I don't know.
I think when I fell down the tunnel, I lost
the orc broke it.
Yeah.
Although those things are pretty big, you could clock an orc upside the head with a windlass and probably damage him if you had to.
Well, I mean, but the same thing with a pistol. It's like, oh, okay, where's your rod? You lose the rod, and anyone that's watched
I accidentally shot it into the orc.
Well, if anyone remembers watching Mad Max Fury Road, he literally does that at one point. It's like I don't have time to do it properly. I'll just shoot it. And it's I think that's again, I don't mind it. What I don't want is what we consider modern firearms like revolvers and things. In my fantasy, I don't mind Renaissance level weapons. Oh, look, you got a duckbill. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The duckfoots.
The duckfoot. Yeah.
I don't even like gadgety kind of steampunky, or even I like repeating crossbows. No. No.
Well, repeating crossbows, if you look at how they're done.
Are you talking about the Chinese one that fired weak darts that had to have poison to be effective?
Well, they work just fine against unarmored opponents, to be fair. And I think that people forget about that. They still work fine. I've seen people use them. Don't get me wrong. It's in a modern era, they're pretty dangerous. But yeah, if you're heavily armored,
I feel like we're at the what was the question part of the section.
We are, yes.
What was the question again, Geek?
Someone at their Saxious is punching the air.
Something
I assume that you're talking about what
weird things we insist on in our games. That was.
I'm wondering if Saxious is the one who's clicked dislike on this stream so far. Somebody has.
It was
damn you.
It's still engagement.
I'm sorry.
Geek. It doesn't matter if it's -1,000,000. It's still engagement. So that's
exactly. It's engagement. That's what counts.
Yes.
So
yes, if you're in chat and you haven't yet clicked on like the stream, well, I promise if you do click like the stream, we will try to stay on topic sometimes.
To get back to your question, I'd say something I do for my world, and it's very important to me, is I don't do the cosmopolitan super tourist medieval world that didn't exist. Merchants may travel long distances, military people might travel long distances, adventurers eventually might travel long distances, but most people are not going very far in their lives. Therefore, you're going to have very strong cultural groups clustered together, creating societies, right? So if you join my game, you say, I want to play a barbarian from the north, and the game's taking place far in the south. Well, how'd that fucker get there then? How's a first level guy got 700 miles and is still first level in a world that's full of monsters and bandits?
Slavery on the ship, and he finally earned his way out.
We're
Thank
back
you.
to
That was
that
a
again.
few.
Huh?
That was a few chapters.
Bringing us
ago
back
in the
around.
conversation.
I don't know, but those are things that, you know, when we talk metropolitan, what was the closest thing you had in most cases? Rome, Constantinople,
One
maybe,
city in the world, you know.
or maybe
Yeah.
Alexandria. You know, those are a few of them where they came in, and usually, like you said, is those were only limited to the rich, the powerful, or wherever they, you know, for the army, wherever you sent them. But then the other part that comes in says, okay, you get your traders, but that was about it. And then areas of pilgrimages. Okay, if you get some place like Mecca, all right, you're expected to go once in your life, and you're going to have a large mass migration of people. And that's about it. And so, you know, that's modern day equivalent. But you're right, for the most part is. But to me, that's what makes games so wonderful in this aspect, is that when you travel, you get to feel a difference. I really was getting tired when I was in Europe in the 90s, and it's gotten worse now. You travel and it feels less and less like each individual country as you go around. It feels very homogenized. And I said, well, wait a minute. That's not what I want. I want, when I go somewhere, to feel, if I'm going to, you know, Ireland, I want it to feel like Ireland, not just like, oh, Disney World Ireland.
We'll have to put out the memo for those countries to keep themselves being backwards for your benefit.
Well, no, but he does
I'm
have a
just
fair
teasing.
point. But
Yeah.
he does have a fair point, because when I first went to Vancouver in '95,
Irish people, Elf Beta's just branded you all backwards.
there you go. Isn't that
Say
nice? When I first went to Vancouver in '95, it wasn't the same. I mean, there was the McDonald's, the Burger King, what have you, but most of like the local stores were very different, and it was a very different city. When I went back in the 2000s, it was the same as Montreal at that point in time. So that level of globalism is going to happen, but you shouldn't see that in a fantasy world.
Yeah, exactly.
You shouldn't see globalism in a fantasy world unless you've created some mechanic or technology or something within the world that allows for that level of
The
globalism.
only places you should see that is in the major trade ports and crossroads. You know, port cities are going to have enclaves of foreigners there.
Sure.
You know, you're going to have that cultural mix, and inland it's going to be even more, you know, unique and weird, because it's going to have to be along some sort of Silk Road somewhere. You know?
Well, and again, that's why I brought up Mecca. There has to be a reason that people are going there, to actually encourage them beyond your normal aspect. And even then, if you look at it, is not that, you know, Islam went, but it didn't go out super far. The closest thing you had until it's maybe if you were looking at the Americas, where people were fleeing and said, okay, we're going to go over there.
I mean, I've had players want their characters to say, you know, be in some small town. They're like, so what news from the capital? I have no idea, says the NPC. I don't go there. Who the hell are you?
See, I go the other way with that too. I make it even harder. Like, I've banned in my game teleporting. There's no quick travel spells. And I even limit like quick communication spells. Like the max you're going to get is like a message spell, 25 words. You know what I mean? And they can respond.
I
25,
found
you know,
ways
one of those deals.
around that in my games to like allow people to still teleport, but make it hard by having it be more location based. You know.
Well, I mean, if we're going to look at teleport, you can have teleport, but what is that? That's an 11th level magic user. It depends on how common you're making your magic users.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Because, okay, that's fine. If we're talking about the, you know, 9th or 10th level or your world-renowned heroes, then okay, yes, your magic user being 11th will be one thing. If it's like the current 5th edition, my friend complained about the characters leveled so quickly they don't even have time to learn their skills. Yeah. So I think that depends on the system from that aspect. And again, I don't mind if there's going to be a trade route from point A to point B, but you know, how much information do you get? Hell, it's hard enough nowadays with modern communication to find out what's going on in a small town two places away from you, because they aren't interested in that information. It's just like, oh,
and it doesn't make the national news, which is all that gets broadcast, or even the local news. Like I live in St. Louis, for example, and occasionally I'll pick up a tidbit about what's going on over in, you know, Kansas City, but it's not that far away, and I have no idea what's going on there for the most part.
Well, I mean, being a little bit different, which is, you know, when we're starting to look at it, how big were most of the towns? How big was London in the 1500s? It was what, 20 or 30,000? It wasn't very big. People forget. The city I live in now is about 80,000, and then we have a sister city right next to us because we've grown big enough. There's that aspect of what's going in there. And when we talk about Tolkien-esque, how far was the Shire? The Shire was what, 3-4 days away from Bree?
Yeah.
Well, the Shire is also a lot bigger than most people think it was too, because where Bilbo lived was one spot in the Shire.
Yeah, but the Shire is no bigger than a
also,
county.
It was also off the beaten track, right? That was
Yeah.
the whole point of the Shires. It wasn't on any major trade routes.
Yeah, like most people didn't even know where it was,
Or had ever seen halflings.
or that it even existed.
Yeah.
Like, what's in that big area over there? I don't know.
And that was over by where the Witch King Angmar had stuff too. It's like Shire. What the hell's the Shire? Because the hobbits stayed by themselves.
Yeah, it's pretty bad when you had to kidnap Smeagol to find out that the Shire and Baggins existed, right? Some guy who lived in a cave was the guy who knew where the Shire was.
It's funny you mentioned the Shire and traveling in XP and what you would gain, because you remember the MERPS game. The one thing that always stood out there was that for every mile you traveled, you got 1 XP point or something. And I'm like, I'm just going to circle my village for days on end.
I think it had to be new territory for it to count.
Who's that? Oh, that's old Mad Buck. What's he doing? I don't know. He says he learns stuff the longer he walks around town.
I don't know, but don't say anything mean to him because he can knock you right on your ass. Okay. He is.
I'm going to bring something else when we talk.
And on weekends he boils anthills. And
while we're talking about Tolkien for this whole thing, I think the other part is, and this is why people are like, I've already heard all this. Yes, because it sold 400 million books.
Yeah.
For his stuff. Even my grandmother knew about it because she read it in the 60s. It just depends on where you are. But when we talk about fantasy, well, okay. Now a lot of people know Harry Potter, which is more of a modern style fantasy. And then the other big IP, if we're looking at it, as far as what's out there, is Game of Thrones. So those are generally your big three that people are aware of for fantasy.
Yeah, we just need more authors to get TV and movie deals.
No. We need good series to get that. It doesn't matter. You bring out crap, it just dies. Like what was the Wheel of Time that Amazon did? It just flopped.
Season 2's coming.
Well, who cares?
Those Rings of Power season 2.
I just want to say hello to a few people who've popped in chat. I haven't said hello to, because I do like to say hello to people when they pop in chat. GM Cody, hello, GM Cody. Jeb's about tonight. Hello, Jeb. And Max just arrived, and Gene has got in from his quiz. Gene, did you win? If not, why not? We nerds are supposed to be clever, so I'm hoping you did win the quiz. Anyway. Our topic tonight is supposed to be our own radical beliefs about fantasy, and we're meant to be trying to justify them and argue about them. Okay, that's supposed to be our topic tonight. We're not very good at that. No.
I don't need to justify it. If you sit down at my table, you're playing the way I present it. If I sit down at your table, I'm playing the way you present it.
Bingo.
Men.
I'm going to bring up one other thing. I think we're all within 5 years of each other for age.
Yes.
So
what was that?
We're all within 5 years of each other for age.
I'm early mid-50s.
I'm not understanding what he said. I'm so sorry. I can barely hear you now.
We're all
within 5 years of each other.
Oh, we're all within 5. I
just thought Bear was joking, saying he was getting old and his hearing was going.
No, that'd have been a really good one had I thought of it.
But we're all very close to 50.
Would you say
plus or minus? So it's. So there's that aspect. Is that, I think that people forget it. So we all grew up on the same stuff, whether we liked it or not. The same movies, the same literature, and everything else. So we have that, and that's why I keep mentioning that the newer generations grew up with Harry Potter. That's their view of fantasy.
Yeah.
Because that was the big thing that came in. Now, don't get me wrong, Lord of the Rings is still there, and so
it's the Jackson movie version.
Yes. But I'm okay with that because I think he did.
And we all know the true version is Rankin and Bass.
Well, here's the other thing. What you're saying goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Is our fantasy archetypes that we grew up with. Number one, came from reading. I think that's a very important thing we're overlooking as opposed to new mediums, right? And the reading that the archetypes we had were people like, the original Lord of the Rings, Far from the Great Mountains, or Conan. And so it sets a certain expectation in our heads as what it should be, and it also a more traditional hero's journey than you see nowadays. Nowadays, the kids today are, like you said, watching movies or listening to something on a podcast or whatever, and they're not having the same immersive level in it because reading, as we know, is very different. Even listening to a book on tape is different than reading the damn book, right? And so their expectations are different than ours because their archetypes are different. They read manga. I don't know what the hell manga was.
Okay.
Things like that make a difference.
Well, see, I grew up with manga as well, and at least when you start doing Robotech and stuff like that with manga science fiction, it's not that I didn't have these influences. I mean, I remember stuff in the '80s and watching everything as well.
That's anime, not manga.
Yeah. Well. My point is, you're splitting hairs on this because I did read both.
No, you're not. Like, that's the thing. Anime and manga are very different beasts, and that's why manga took popularity and grew. Later than anime, because anime was easily digestible for the viewer to watch and go, "Oh, I'm in." It was TV, whereas manga is intensely different.
Well, to me, you're just talking two different mediums, the same thing, because they just converted a lot of the manga to anime.
When you convert a manga to an anime, it changes. It's like it's.
Hold it.
A good example would be the Marvel comic books versus the MCU, right?
Yeah,
they're the same universe, but there's a little lost in translation. You have to condense and digest, pre-digest.
As Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, but we've already discussed this with TV and stuff like that. My whole point really is that these same influences that were there, whether it be manga, because I remember reading manga, and and watching anime, it's no different than watching the Rankin Bass and then going back and reading The Hobbit years later. You go through it, you still have those influences. The other part is, and I'm going to mention this because I don't think a lot of the kids are getting this nowadays, we also grew up on the classic Greek mythology and things like that. And many of these kids are not. So we get a different aspect of, King Arthur. We get, Clash of Titans, Perseus, things like this. We got the old style from there. And then the other part, I think, is, and I know that you guys mentioned this earlier, is the miniature wargaming aspect. Is we have a lot of that. Most players nowadays have not played a lot of miniature war games as a classic thing, and part of it is you don't want the really big, powerful spells because it would wipe out the other side very quickly. So it didn't make it for a very enjoyable tabletop experience game.
Speak for yourself. We all want Chaos Vortex.
And I've never been a miniatures player, so I have no relation or touchstone for that.
I have.
For reading, we're talking about books. We're talking about Lord of the Rings. We talked about Conan, and we talked about Elric, and we've made all these things. My first fantasy series I read as a young man, almost a preteen, was Narnia. Yeah, that was my first exposure to fantasy writing. Was Narnia, and then from there I went to Dune. By the time I got to Lord of the Rings, my brain was warped.
I was reading mythology and stuff before I was reading fantasy stuff, and then for me, a lot of my, like I was mentioning earlier, I didn't really get into Tolkien as a kid because every adult in my life was hyper fixated on Tolkien.
Yeah, and boomers loved it.
And so like I would pick up weird stuff. Like I still haven't finished this series because I could never find the whole series, but I tried reading it when I was in school. It's called The Prince in Waiting. And what's weird is it was another one of those odd early fantasies. It's fantasy until you read far enough and you realize that it used to be our world and then it blew up and now it's magic. But and then one I remember that was, talk about weird influences. Like there was another one called The Wolf King, and turns out it's not really fantasy at all. It's more just historical fiction that takes place at the transition between the Bronze and Iron Age. But there was a Wolf King in my D&D games.
But we have a lot of those influences, and I think that, to be fair on this, is we're saying these things, but a lot of D&D was it was originally college-educated kids a lot of times. They were, and then it started moving down when we got basic D&D to the younger, the I want to call it early teens. That's when it started moving further down. Now, I started when I was 8, just because all the middle schoolers were playing D&D. We were like, "Oh, this is so cool!" But to be fair, I was a nerdy kid, and nothing's changed since as an adult. But yeah, I watch people now, and they can barely read. Many of them are dyslexic, so they've had, reading for them was hard. A lot of them are not that great at math. So it's opened itself up a lot more, and as such, people take the influences that they see on television and everything else, which is fine. I'm not disagreeing that people should do what they want, but when I want to play a fantasy, I like the gritty, low fantasy aspect. I don't want a high fantasy.
One thing D&D did for me, I mean, I picked it up with Mensa Redbox in '84, and I was in high school, right? So friend showed it to me, blah blah blah. He says, "Oh, you gotta play this before you do advanced." I don't know anything. That's what I did. And then he says, "You got to read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. We got to read The Hobbit first." So I waited forever for my library to get in, and I did. So once I got into it, it sparked like this thirst to learn more about medieval history and everything about it, right? And so I'd be taking my skateboard down to the library, picking up books and taking them home. And back then, if I didn't have books, I didn't have money for books. I had a set of World Book encyclopedias. So my whatever I read had to be in my head. I had to read it to memorize it because I had to return the damn book in a few weeks, right? And so it helped me to learn. It helped keep things in my head. Whereas now as Elon Musk says, we've offloaded our memory into the internet. We don't need to remember anything anymore. And so because of that, we're not churning up all this knowledge and information into this weird soup, and out comes something magnificent anymore. We're not having these genius moments,
I'm going to bring up something here because we're talking about this, but and I don't disagree with you. It encouraged me to learn economics and stuff. Well, I want my world to be more realistic.
Yeah.
And I think the problem that we're having, because we're at that age, I think some of it is that people don't want their world to be realistic.
Yeah.
They want to be pure fantasy, as far away from reality as possible, whereas I want it to be as close as possible with having some of the other stuff. So
You want to be familiar, but you still want your escape.
yes. Well,
I just want my world to be logical.
Yes.
That's
Has
what I
to
mean.
make sense.
If you're talking about the thing that I have to have in my campaigns, regardless of how weird and wacky they might get, I do have to have that verisimilitude, that believability, that even if it's crazy wackadoo, it still has to be believable and consistent crazy wackadoo.
One thing that Tolkien's world does have is that underlying consistency. Underlying, very much so, and he goes into great detail describing aspects of the world. And absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why many of us from that era who would have grown up with Tolkien as an influence do tend to lean towards that style of game where the fantastical stays fantastical because it's not commonplace, it's not everywhere, it's not on every street corner.
I think I'm the last guy to start waxing generational differences, but I think also we're of that generation that gamed with the concept of loss being something that was okay.
Yeah.
Like the lose state, like that's, so like the death of a character. I mean, I have, even back in the day, seen people pitch a fit and, storm off from a table when a character died. So it's not like that's that was never there, but the fear of losing a character, because games, which is what it is, have a win-lose state, and they always talk about how you win D&D. Well, you don't really win D&D. The only way you really win D&D is by having a good time and continuing your character, and that's about the only victory state. But you can lose D&D, by having your character die. But that's just part of it. But that's like, but then you make another one. It's like early video games. Okay, I've got 4 lives. I've died. I'm gonna, And I think we were a little bit more open to that. And of course, the style of play has a lot to do with that, because we were just dungeon crawling and killing things. Even though my group did a lot more story based stuff. So I think that factors into a lot of the why we like the believable worlds, because dying because the world is dangerous and you challenged the world and it caught up to you is much different than dying because the game is rigged against you and you don't, and the game is stupid in the first place and doesn't make sense.
Wait, you played with my original DM? Oh wow!
I played with some of those guys.
You
I'm
know,
going
it's
to do
interesting.
such and such. You can't do such and such. But the guy just did such and such. No, yeah, I know
Yeah.
he did it, but you can't. Okay, that makes sense.
I had a guy say, "You open the door." Okay, I open the door. Okay, you're dead. I'm like, "Why am I dead?" Because, well, okay, I opened the door and I'm dead.
I sat at a convention table once, and I was playing Warhammer at the time, but behind me was a D&D game going on. It was just a little local convention. It was in a school lunchroom somewhere, and I hear the DM go, and so the great vaulted doors open, and inside the room are 5 ancient red dragons. I'm like, why the fuck are you playing with this guy?
Yeah.
Like 5 ancient red dragons? Come on!
In a 10 by 10 foot room.
Yeah, with a 5-foot hallway leading to it.
I mean, that's just a killer GM, but
That's just an asshole.
yeah. But again, that verisimilitude, though. I mean, if my character dies because the world is consistent and I screwed up, I'm much happier with that than the world I died because this world makes no sense and I can't figure it out.
Well, I think the other part is, there needs to be a vision. Now, for me, I hate killing off characters. I do as a DM. That said, I will punish you. You will lose items. You will lose limbs. You will suffer. That.
Well, and the thing is, I think people need to remember there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I always try to, when I'm trying to explain to people what, trying to talk them into, can we play with ammo again? Can we play with rations again? Can we play with torches again and stuff like that?
Because tracking is fun. Is not fun.
And the thing is, they're like, well, that's not. I'm like, look, when you watch a movie or read a book, what are your favorite parts? Are your favorite parts where the guy is just sitting around, nothing's happening, and everything's tra-la-la and perfectly honky-dory? Or are your favorite parts where he's in danger? He's in some sort of state of adversity. That's when you're enjoying that character. That's when that character shines. Han Solo shooting Greedo is really neat because up until the point where he does that, you kind of feel like he's cornered. Yeah.
Well, no. Let's, for all of us that watched the Empire Strikes Back, when Han Solo was frozen and they got away with him, you're like, what in the world's going on? This isn't supposed to happen. Luke's not supposed to lose his hand either.
And that's the thing, it's like, those are some of my favorite times. The stories that get told over and over and over at tables, in my groups at least, are the ones where stuff went wrong.
Yeah.
Those get told more often than, remember that time when we swept that module and never actually had a problem? Nobody talks about that. But when you were down 3 levels and you were down to 1 torch and you're running out of arrows and your sword had gotten munched by the rust monster and the fighter was down to 2 hit points and the cleric was out of spells and the wizard was pretty much half dead and being carried around on a stretcher, that's what you remember.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
One of the first old school adventures I introduced my more current group to. It was around 2014. I converted to 5th edition because they were 5th edition players at the time. They play all sorts of things now, and I'm quite proud of that. But I converted Castle Amber to 5th edition and ran them through that, and they still wax lyrical about it being one of their favorite adventures of all time. And they talk about the time that they lost where they had a first major character death due to the magic jar spell that happens in it.
Yeah.
There we go.
I'm still thoroughly convinced that most of those people who argue against consumables and all of that just haven't tried it, honestly, and just they're going on the fiction of it.
People just want the highlight. They want the highlight of the story. They don't want the
they want the trailers. They want the whole movie. One of my long-term players, one of the game campaigns, one of the events in a campaign they'll talk about forever is when they rolled into a town that a medieval tournament was happening at a tourney, and they had to go through a massive amount of running around to try and make the mounted warrior they have look legit as a noble to enter him in the tourney, and they were like trying to scrape together coins to go buy tents and get food for a feast and get forged patents and everything. And it was like nothing to do with how many arrows they had. It was them using their brains and their characters' abilities to try and scam an entire city that this guy was a legit knight as opposed to whatever. And then that part of the adventure lasted 4 sessions, and it's still to this day, 10 years later, something they'll talk about is like, remember Ardennes? Remember Ardennes? Yeah, Ardennes. And it was, it was fun, and it was human in its own sort of the fallible way of doing things, and the chaos they got into, and the halfling thief sneaking into the jewelers to try and steal this necklace so that they could give it as a gift to this one lord's daughter. And
well, that's the other thing I was talking about. Like with the adversity, that creates adventure.
yeah,
When that when that character dies and he's a high enough level to where it's worth your time, or he's beloved enough, you go on a quest to find the resurrection,
sure.
You're out of coin, and you don't really want to take that job, but you have to take the job because you need to afford the training to go up to the next level. I mean, if you watch, I'm gonna plug a channel, but if you watch Sean's channel, you can see all the time how an acceptance of the I guess the suck of the game, and I say the suck because the outside perception, because he's got characters, attacking each other, swindling each other in the one game. Now, granted, that's they're kind of doing the evil game, but even in his OSE game, he's got conflicting agendas. He's got things going horribly wrong, and people keep coming back.
Yeah.
And
So again, by the way, congratulations, Sean, on 1K subscribers, sir.
Absolutely.
Hey, good job, man.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah, hit the 1,000. Was it today or yesterday? It was
Yesterday I ticked over. Yeah, yesterday I ticked over.
Now he can
Very
retire
nice.
to his private island.
Welcome to the world of making $20 a year off of YouTube.
Yeah.
sir.
$20 a year. Wow, I thought it was only like 5. Oh,
Hey,
I
it's
know.
$20 American. Oh,
I think I made,
Yeah,
yeah, but then the US will, or the Google will take 30% of that. So
they do, by
Yeah.
the way. And you can only cash out when you reach 100, by the way. just so you know.
yeah,
I
I
made-
wonder how much they just sit on the stuff that I mean, clearly they're scamming a lot of folks. They're like, oh, sorry, you can't cash out, but I will never make that much. Yes, and we collect interest on it the entire time we have it.
Mhm.
I made
I have no idea what you're talking about. Google are my
$150.
friends.
I made $150, $150 in 6 months, and that's what a lot of videos. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Relatively
Yeah.
a lot, right? Maybe one a
That's
week.
why I
Took
don't
me
even
6 months,
try.
took me 6 months to get to 100. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like it's a fun thing to do. That's all it is.
Yeah,
I
dude.
can maybe write off some.
I'm gonna have to
This,
duck out.
this
folks.
has to be something you enjoy doing. Oh,
Oh,
dude,
the,
Elf, man.
the
Take it easy.
verisimilitude of real life calls, and I have to go deal with
Later,
it.
man.
See you soon, Eli.
Be good, man.
Cheers.
I got the second
if you don't
spot.
love doing this, if you don't enjoy making these videos and doing these live streams and talking to the viewers and building a community, you're doing something. I don't know what you're doing, but it's not the right reason to be here on YouTube. I mean, unless you're XP to level 3 or these guys that have really got a format and a style and they're appealing to a certain market.
Yeah.
You're come on.
Yeah, but even they started where we started.
Yeah.
Ginny D just put out a video today talking about
Yes.
how it took like 7 years for her to get to a point where she was making a living off of it.
And she's a
Yep.
cute woman, not an old bastard like we all.
Yeah,
are.
she's not an ugly old toe like us. Exactly.
I
I'm
will-
sexy. Give me money.
Yeah.
I will argue that, this shows my pedantic nature, that she can't call herself Ginny D because the way she spells it, die.
Okay. All right.
Right.
Jenny Di, he's saying because DI is not pronounced D, it's pronounced Die, like Lady Di, Princess
Mhm.
Diana,
Yes,
Di,
yes.
Dinah Shore,
Yeah.
But America, it's D, hence Dee is DIDI. That's
Dinah
the name.
Shore.
Dee Dee.
How old are you there? Dinah
I'm old enough to
Shore?
know who
Really?
Dinah Shore is, my friend.
Holy crap.
I'm a dinosaur who knows who
Dinah-
Dinah Shore
Dinah Shore.
is.
There you go.
Not a dinosaur. Anyway, and talking of characters having little failings, Daniel's arrived. Hello, Daniel. How are you? His in the OSE game at the weekend, his character lost an eye.
Uh-huh.
Where do you have it last?
How did he lose it? Through fun and games.
Oh, shenanigans.
And it came out with a big schlop when they pulled the arrow out of his head. Yes.
This is why I like Against the Dark Master, by the way, for the MERP Rollmaster crowd. I absolutely love the critical tables because they create stories for you with the players, when they have an error. In one of the test fights we ran, the guy with the bow got a fumble, and the fumble was he dropped all his arrows on the ground. It's like, well, there goes that rapid fire bullshit you were doing for the first, the previous 2 rounds, because now you're going to pick them up. But I like game mechanics that do stuff like that don't just fuck the character, but challenge the character and give them adversity to deal with.
Well, and I think the other part is, while you're talking about this, is people forget adversity is what builds your character for stories.
Absolutely.
And without this, it's kind of, it didn't. Well, what it reminds me of is these people who say, well, the game is boring. And then you find out they didn't do any of the hard aspects of the game that keep people coming back.
Which takes us back to Tolkien, the whole aspect of the adversities that those innocent little hobbits faced on those journeys to do whatever they were doing.
But that's just storytelling 101. It doesn't matter the genre. That's storytelling 101.
Right. Well, but see, most people, this is what I've been noticing, and I'm not saying that people have to like Shakespeare, but it seems like a lot of them were rejecting Shakespeare and things. They were teaching you how to do your stories, and there are whole books now, and it's like, wait a minute, guys, go read the 3 acts. Go read great literature, and it will help you understand. But instead, it's kind of like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm better than that. Like, you're not better until you learn the basics.
They don't read
but at
either.
the same time, remember that it's a book, it's a movie, it's a play, it's a comic, it's a radio drama. They are different mediums. They have different rules, and they'll play out differently than a game because you don't have a writer on your side helping you. It's like doing Whose Line Is It Anyway? That's the closest media to role playing. You know what I mean? It's like, just make shit up and see what happens, right? But you can be inspired by the 3-act model. You can be inspired by Shakespeare. You can be inspired by all of those things. But I've run into referees or storytellers in my day who are like just strict pedants about it, and it's like,
no.
Your games fall apart.
Well, the real point is that you can have stuff going on in the background without railroading characters in there necessarily. But then you can also, but you push that over, which is, hey, look, this is an easy adventure, but guess what? There are certain adventures that you're going to have to run away from. And boy, players really get into it when they find that one villain. It doesn't matter where the villain comes in, that doesn't even have to kill him. Just beats him, throws him in jail, humiliates them, steals their stuff, and leaves. And then they'll be like, I want revenge on him. And then now you built the whole story there. I mean,
speaking of story and mediums, I don't think we can see. I'm not a video game guy,
Sure.
but the last time I really did play with anything with any intensity was the early 2000s with EverQuest. And right now, I think the main medium for people who are writing really good stories, they write really good stories in video games, and a lot of people spend so many millions of hours playing video games that it definitely influences their D&D likes and expectations. EverQuest, the original incarnation of it, way the hell back in the day, if you died and you couldn't recover your body, your shit was lost forever, and you starting over. I can't remember how many times I'm begging for a Spirit of the Wolf to run across to get a corpse that I could loot my stuff off of because I died in a dangerous zone. And if I didn't get there within 8 hours or something, it was gone forever. Nowadays, World of Warcraft, it's so easy that you're not going to ever really have any major loss, just a little bit of a time setback, right?
I'm going to say this. I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but look at the single player game, like The Witcher, which is very in depth. If you go through that whole thing, you're looking at 100+ hours.
Yeah.
But it has a storyline, and it has a branching story arc that if you get it wrong, you get, and it turns in ways you don't expect. It's like, oh, I did all the right things. What do you mean that the kids died?
Knights of the Old Republic.
Yeah. There's great
choices
stories being
change the
told.
story.
There's great stories being told in video games. I dare say there's so many great writers are being moving over to video games because they get paid well to do something. To write a great story for video games, or they're not writing fiction because, let's face it doesn't pay. It just doesn't pay to write.
Jeff Grubb was one of the greatest RPG writers of all time. I'm sorry, I will say that without any shame.
Yeah.
And what does he do these days? He works in video games.
Yeah. That's where the money is.
I mean, even if you look at a lot of them, let's go for Ultima, the Richard Garriott, Sandy Peterson.
Jake Ways.
A lot of them did that because they.
Whoops.
Well, go ahead. What's so funny, Bear? Sorry.
You were in the middle of a
You
sentence,
blocked
you
out.
vanished, and then you came right back. It was like, furthermore, what?
Well, that's fine. But I pretty much said what I was going to say anyway. But you can have the storyline in the background, and if the players don't interact, the world's still moving.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why when they say that there's a problem with having DMs is the expectations. Maybe I want to put it this way because I think that Sean has shown us all, for those who haven't realized it, what a random game can be that creates its own stories just by letting the tables go. It's like, it's kind of just creates its own story based on whatever you're like. Well, what's the logic of why there's this trace?
I just want to address something Mars saying in the chat. Yes, but JMS wrote Spider-Man after Babylon 5. George R.R. Martin was writing TV long before Game of Thrones.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
So that's the thing. So some of these guys cut their teeth in different mediums, and guys like Roy Thomas in comics eventually went over to TV writing and film writing and stuff like that as well. So it's look, if you're writing, and you're storytelling. But again, for me, role-playing games, it's a very different beast and a different kind of storytelling. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you don't want to structure your game specifically like you would structure a story, like
it's a
novel
railroad.
or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
it becomes a railroad, and those kind of games, they just I tune right out. I can't do it.
Yep.
So look, to go back to the event I was telling you about with the tournament thing, that was all my players. The only thing they were supposed to have happen, and it still happened in the town they were in, was that a Dark Knight showed up and was killing off nobles, and they had to figure out what was going on and explore that mystery to figure out who's summoned this creature and why is it killing people. Everything else around that was them doing their thing.
Yeah.
Had I been trying to do it like a story, we wouldn't have had all that great stuff happen because I would have just laser focused on the one plot, right?
Yeah, you set up the event, you set up the framework, and then let them tear it down as they will.
Or build it up.
Well, even when they talk about writers, they said that the characters start getting life of their own, and they start to they will go instead of them going through it. And I think that's the important part is you have it. When we're talking about this with Tolkien, okay, he could have done several things in there, which always bothered the hell out of me. Why don't they fly the eagles in? Well, that was never quite explained until much later. But
Was it ever explained? I still don't know the damn reason why I didn't fly the eagles in.
Because they were creatures of free will and not a taxi service.
well,
That's ultimately what it boils down to,
it's
right?
because the Nazgul were circling the area, and if they had come in, then the Nazgul would have unknown and attacked them while they were flying in.
That's a fan theory.
Well, it makes sense from that one aspect, but then I guess the other point is we don't know how far the eagles can fly because they have to fly and land. We're looking at when you look at the map, they're traveling thousands of miles over months. It's not.
But there's the D&D player mentality, right? Which is, didn't we meet giant eagles 3 sessions ago? Well, why can't we go back to the giant eagles and convince them to fly us where we need to go? And
then the DM should go. Then you do it. You have to travel back, and there's random encounters, and you get to the eagles, and the guy with the low charisma opens his mouth at the wrong time, and the eagles will say, "Piss off!
Yep.
We'll never have to do with you again."
Well, I'm going to bring up a different aspect, which is, they can get the eagles. The eagles can carry you for 2 hours. That gets you approximately 60 miles. Now they have to rest for a day. Let's be honest, the eagles don't say how far they fly. It's not until they pick up Frodo, which weighs almost nothing compared to everybody else.
Gandalf's an old man, so he probably weighs nothing too.
Well, I don't know. Looking at us now, we're all in the.
Yeah, he's a skinny old mage. We're fat asses. Come on. we're old men of a modern world. He's a walking guy with a stick.
Did you guys see the Tolkien interview where he explains the eagles?
No. What's that?
I think his answer was kind of like just it would make for a shit story. Shut the hell up, wasn't it? Something to that effect.
Oh, don't spoil the joke. God damn it!
Oh, all right.
John Byrne did this. John Byrne did this at a Comic-Con, where he was doing question and answer from the crowd, and someone said, "Why doesn't Lex Luthor just take some kryptonite, make a bullet, and then have the best, have Deadshot or someone go and shoot Superman with the bullet when he's out in public?" And Byrne, to his credit, looks at the guy and goes, "You know what? I bet you're really proud of that question. I bet you really feel good. You put a lot of thought into it, and it's really cool that you came and asked it. And the answer is because dead Superman doesn't sell comics." That's the answer, And it was really a good way of looking at it.
Nice.
And I think people are okay with that too. Just be honest about it.
Well, listen, you sometimes have to. I write fiction. Obviously, we all tend to, but I try and write comics and stuff like that. And every now and then, I have to remember characters are human. And in my life, I'd like to think I'm not a complete moron. I've done some pretty stupid shit. In hindsight, gone, I should have done this differently. I've seen people I know who are intelligent do stupid shit. I've seen stupid people do smart shit. So the idea that your characters are always going to make the right choice, they're always going to do the right thing, is absolute nonsense. And you don't see that anywhere more perfectly than watching players make choices in a D&D game.
And that's where you get the analysis paralysis, because people want to make that perfect choice. They want, they'll sit there and say, "Oh, well, I can't. Okay, what'll happen if I do this?" Well, do it and find out. But what if it's wrong?
It's called life, buddy. It's called life.
I'm gonna bring the other part up in there. Is it's not just that. It's now if you got good players and they're going to have to make the logical choice or the choice that their character would make. And I said, well, I'm going to follow what my character will do, even though I know it's wrong. That's where sometimes it gets very interesting to seeing how that spirals out.
Two ways to look at that, though. One is that's what my character would do, and then he just does some stupid shit that justifies nonsense. We all hate those guys, but the really good role players will do something against their character's interest, because that's what my character would do.
Can barely hear you, Joe. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. When his mic moves sometimes. Some of the really good role players will do something against their character's interest, because that's what my character.
Right. I would say that the aim of a role-playing game is to do what your character would do, but because you are the player, you as the player are defining your character's personality. The onus is on you to make a character who will do something constructive in terms of the game itself.
Mark just made a really great point, by the way.
If what your character would do is something that derails the game, then you are a bad player. You've made a mistake by making a character that will cause problems.
Well, how I'm going to put this is, you can tell someone's making, like you said, the detrimental choice for their character, even though when it's in character is, you know what, I'm going to examine this egg that's glowing. Oh, okay. And well, now you have a face hugger on you. Those are, but that also allows you to sometimes develop it. But everyone's like, when you start using your meta knowledge, this is the hard part, especially as you get to know the monsters more and more. Your first level character or your third level character has never encountered this before. He doesn't know. Your 10th or 12th level characters probably encountered a lot of these monsters. They would know better. But if you go over like, let me go poke this, or hey, there's a trap right there. You don't know it's a mimic. And you don't know there's a trap. Everyone else was like, hold on here. But I think that's another hard part that people have is separating the two.
And going back to something we discussed a lot earlier, separating what a character's in-game feelings within a fantasy world with different cultures, different technology, and whatever, different social expectations would be compared to what the player thinks now.
Yeah.
That's.
So fables and parables are what taught us our thought processes as children, right?
Yeah.
So we all know the story of the lion with the thorn, and the mouse pulls the thorn, and now the lion and the mouse are best friends, or whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. These are all parables that were raised. It's cultural touchstones for us. My ex was from India, and she grew up most of her life in India and only moved to Canada when she was 16, 17 years old. She didn't have the same cultural touchstones or parables or things like that. So oftentimes when we'd watch American movies, I'd have to explain to her certain choices that were made by characters based on things like that, and vice versa. When we'd watch Indian movies together, she'd have to explain stuff to me. Now, role-playing can only go so deep down that hole, right? Which is why Tolkien used England and maybe Germania as his basis for the culture, so that the English audience watching it would go, I completely understand all of this because I get the logic of the characters, going back to that concept of verisimilitude. In a role-playing game, it becomes difficult if you start getting into cultures that are so far removed from the cultures we know here. How do you get that verisimilitude at that point in time? How do you get those cultural touchstones? How do you get the concept that your character grew up being told stories and tales that formed how they problem solve, that formed how they think about situations?
That's easy. You give your characters a 58-page background for your setting, which nobody will ever read.
Well, you're right. So you do an encyclopedia about their culture and write all the fairy tales their nanny told them.
Yeah.
Right.
You'll never read it.
So. You finesse it in as you play. I mean, you know, you bring your first level character with, you know, one paragraph, not even a page, a paragraph, just to give you something, a leaping off point. And then things come up randomly, and it's like, oh, yes, well, my father told me this story. Boom, that's now part of your character back. So you don't have to have it all laid out. You just sort of finesse it. And the next thing you know, by the time you're around 4th or 5th level, you've got a fully fleshed out background that just sort of came out organically.
I'm gonna mention something else here, because Tolkien built his whole world behind there, along with the mythology and everything else, and wrote all that out before he even did Lord of the Rings. You know, that's why his son was pulling all the notes from. You know, and to be fair, this is why a lot of people, including myself, will pick up an already established IP because I don't have to do all that work. I mean, anyone that looks at RuneQuest, they have a lot of that stuff in it. You start reading the book, you know, when they start talking about settings. You know, that was one of the things with Forgotten Realms, when they start having all those different books, they start talking about some of the histories. They really go into depth for some of those if you're willing to really immerse yourself. I think that's part of the reason that I used to, well, I still do, I like to buy a lot of the books. They have all that background story and stuff that I don't have to create. If you're creating it for yourself and you don't have a well-rounded aspect, if I don't know how economics work, I don't know how this works, I don't know, and I don't know about you guys, but if I start reading a setting and it doesn't make sense at all, I feel cheated, and I'm like, something's just wrong, even if I can't specify exactly what it is. But, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why would this occur? Why would they have, you know, a trade route here when they already have this? It just feels off to you. And, you know, to me, that is a bigger fantasy suspension of disbelief that I have to do than saying, oh, there are dwarves up in the mountains or that there are elves in the woods. That to me is easy.
So Baron de Ropp does a great series of videos where he talks about the geopolitics of Faerun and the geopolitics of Greyhawk and stuff like that. They're really good videos. And what he did with his one on Greyhawk made me, when I run Greyhawk, turn Furiondi into horse lords, because of the way he looked at the geopolitics of where they were and all that. Goes, these are probably nomadic people. They probably deal with horses based on where they're living and how the river systems and all that. It's like, shit, I never thought about that. Up until that point in time, Furiondi were just a bunch of guys in armor and being knights. But if we certainly make them horse lords and, you know, basically mobile cavalry like Rohan, that's more interesting. Now that world's got another level of complexity and stuff to it. So the world building that you're talking about, Omanal, is right. But if you don't have that level of world building and something's so weird, well, again, I'm going to go back to, you know, pedal throne of the pedal or whatever, pedal throne, or, you know, this stuff where it's just like so bizarre. You're like, what the fuck am I reading? You know, the Young Kingdoms are weird in Elric, but they make sense. You can understand how Pantang exists. You can understand how Melnibone exists. You can understand all these things happen. Some of the stuff that these people are right, it's just like it's their drug trips that they're putting down on paper, and it's like, okay, I get it. You know, you did ayahuasca and you talked to the mechanical elves, but I don't buddy. You know, I'm sorry.
But I think also that's why I've heard that, and I don't know if this is entirely true, that writers really hit their peak in their 50s because they have to have those world experiences, and I think that's also part of the problem. Is a lot of it is wish fulfillment rather than trying to say, I want a good story. Where will this go? And then, you know, to me, it's the same thing. Like I know that Joe was talking about. I wanted to learn economics. It's part of the reason I became an engineer. If it wasn't D&D, who knows where the hell I would have gone. But I was like, oh, I want to learn this. Oh, let me learn how actually insects move so it makes it feel more real. And in some ways, it also can be scarier because it's both familiar and horrific when you start looking at what bugs start doing when they start chewing your characters up and things. You're like, oh yeah, okay, that's I don't want that to happen to me.
What's interesting along that line is that Ray Feist, who wrote the Nicamia books, Pug and Magros and Thomas and the Valaru and all that stuff, he wrote that stuff after having played D&D in the 70s with his group and a college group of like really smart, geeky kind of people. And he had, wrote little short stories and this and that for his group about what happened. And then when he lost his job as a social worker around age 30 or so, got laid off or something. And his group sort of said, hey, why don't you just try to write fiction? Feist, I guess it's Feist, had a contact through his stepfather in Hollywood and got an agent and he got published. Now, when I read those books when I was 15, he had written when he was 30, they were amazing. They were the best books I'd ever read. I have the greatest memories. I must have read them 15 times. I went back to read them recently, and I'm like, Jesus, this is written for kids, because Feist was 30 years old when he wrote them. If Feist were to write that same series now at age 60-something years old, completely different thing. George R.R. Martin could not have written a series with the depth and complexity of the Game of Thrones when he was 30 either. That's, I think, the reason why my games are so much different and better now. I mean, besides being an adult and being a kid, they're better now than they were 10 years ago because I know more. I am more. I'm more of a person.
You've got world experiences to draw on to make to add depth to them. Yeah.
I know how people
matured.
I know how they think. And that goes into it. So I think some of the best fiction, the best stories, the best DMing, I look forward to just hopefully getting better and better and enjoying it more and more because of that and giving more and more pleasure to my players.
Well, this is something that we're seeing in modern screenwriting, right? In television and film. Writers who have no experience, no world experience, writing these things that have no verisimilitude to them. Whereas a lot of the stuff we grew up on, a lot of the stuff this group grew up on, be it Doctor Who, Star Trek, whatever the case may be, were written by men who had gone through either World War II, Korea, or even Vietnam at some points. Some of the later stuff in the 80s we saw. So they were drawing on a lot of that world experience they had in the stories they were telling. It's a different beast. Experience teaches you, and as a writer and as a DM, experience is going to make you very different. When I was teaching, the teacher I was when I started versus 15 years later when I stopped, very different teacher. Like the experiences that taught me things. I learned more as I went, and I was able to refine my technique. Same for writing, same for role playing, same for music. I'm sure, this is the reality of it all. So you're 100% on point, Joe.
Look, Tolkien was in his 30s when he wrote The Hobbit,
and he'd been through World War.
Yeah, and he'd had a lot of experience, obviously World War I experiences. But Lord of the Rings, he was pushing 60. By the time that was released.
I read one of his letters where he's talking about how his World War II was happening around him, and he found himself in Moria and didn't know where he was going from there because the darkness was taking over so much in his mind because of the darkness he saw in the world around him. That level of awareness, that level of experience, like that level of awareness requires a level of experience. You know what I mean? Like you need to be able to go, oh, I see why this is happening. When we're young, we don't see it as much. We just kind of react. As hopefully we get older, we reflect.
I'm going to bring the other part is I think a lot of times, and this is when you talk about Hollywood stuff, is a lot of it is wish fulfillment.
Yes.
Without understanding what the costs are to get those wishes. My son was talking about, which was funny because I was in Hungary. We were talking about the monkey's paw. And he's like, I wanted adventure. And when I took him to Hungary, he said, it's just like the monkey's paw. You don't really get what you wish for because he was tired of us running him around all over the country to go and seeing things. He's like, I just want to stay home. And I think that's where some of it comes down to is, if I talk about a great sci-fi is Babylon 5. When they have Malari and Morden. And Morden comes over and like, what do you want? And he goes, no, what do you really want? And he goes over, well, I want this. And he gets everything he asked for. And the cost was so high that he wished that he never had that. And then his younger, naive, Veer, what do you want? He says, I want to live just long enough to watch your head put on a spike. So the next 10 generations know that, exactly. Know that some bargains cost too much, or whatever. And I think that's the problem that we're having with modern writers is they're throwing in 20-year-olds that have no real world experience. Don't get me wrong. If you're from Afghanistan and you went through a couple of wars and stuff, you have some like real in-depth, feelings, and I understand writing for stuff, but these others, it's just like your entire life has been school. You've been pampered and protected. You go to college, you've been pampered and protected from even ideas that don't agree with you, and you're not used to actual intellectual debate, and you throw it out there and it just falls flat. You're like, what is this? It makes no sense. Even the romances don't make sense. None of it feels real. It just feels like
there's no consequence to anything, and there's no striving for any achievement because they've never striven, whatever. They've never had to strive for a god darn thing in their life because they were given it, because they went to a pampered school, had connections with parents, whatever it was, and they got into this thing. Right. And so now they have no experience in actually working their ass off to get there, and they have no experience to draw upon. And not only does the world experience, you need to spend decades, unless you're a natural, which who is, you need to spend decades honing the craft of writing itself. So you need to have the experiences plus the craft down. And they have neither.
Well, and also the younger stuff can come off. I'm sorry, and this is a bit of we're on a tangent, but or a sidetrack. But I find some of the younger writer stuff I see in sci-fi these days is preachy. It's not. It's not like the older stuff where the older writers are trying to say, "Hey, here's a secret little lesson about life. We're going to sneak into this adventure story about spaceships.
Here are two equally valid points of view. Discuss." Yeah.
It's here's why you're wrong, and this is what I know is true.
Okay. What I know in all my vast 23 years of experience, what I know is true, right? It's like goes back to Star Trek, the original series. They had lessons in there all the time, but it was in true classic sci-fi. They just threw it out there to make you think about like the guy with the black and white on one side and the guy in the black and white on the other side. I didn't catch that the first time I noticed.
Battlefield.
It's a beautiful episode, and it makes you think afterwards. And I'm a kid, I'm a teenager watching. It's like, holy crap, what an amazing thing. Because they didn't preach it at me, I just let it go. I let it think. And these guys who wrote Star Trek, if you notice the Enterprise and the way they acted on it, it was very military in style because most of the writers served in World War II or Korea. So they understood military action. They understood why it made sense to have things happen a certain way in a starship.
And I agree with Grumpy Old Slan right there. Is if anyone watched the Outer Limits from the 90s, a lot of times they would just ask the question, and then you had to come up with your own, well, what have I learned? And sometimes it worked out well, sometimes it didn't. There was always the same, the old Twilight Zone. It was like, part of it is, whenever you read great stories, is what would I do in their place? Because if it's an easy choice, then it's like, oh, well, there is no hard choice. But whenever you have to go through with it, and it sounds terrible, those are the things that come down to it. Is you want those hard choices in your games to go through it. Now, of course,
I was going to say, isn't this the essence of a good role-playing game scenario?
Yeah.
Hey, what do? Do you? I hate saying this. Your perfect example is Gandalf. We're going to talk Tolkien-esque, standing at the bridge. You shall not pass. Do the other players stand and fight with Gandalf, or do they run? Do we lose everything, or do we just lose the one character?
Sadly, in the role-playing game, everybody's like, well, I want to run over and do this, and I want to shoot him with an arrow, and I want to cast this spell. We role-play.
Well, it sounds that way, but let's be honest. If you're playing with a high lethality game, that's a true sacrifice, because now you're like, look, you guys can get a complete TPK on this. Oh. And it only has to happen once or twice. I think that John has mentioned this. You're like, let's run away. And when the one character says, I'm going to stand and just hold them off so you guys can escape, it's like, you've got to go.
Well, okay. We've all read Elric, right? We've all read the Elric book here.
I'm still on the second.
Listen, hate to do the spoilers thing, but they're 50-year-old books, so I'm allowed to spoil them.
Yeah, of course.
That ending. I was in the final analysis. I was 1,000 times more evil than you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
A kid's not going to write that.
No.
To take a character on that insane journey for so long, and then to just flip it like that at the very last minute, that requires a level of experience to understand how impactful and important that is. It's one of the reasons why, for me, the Brian Herbert Dune books are awful. They're
Terrible.
just awful.
Yeah.
They're terrible because they don't have the one thing that his father had, which was he was analyzing desert culture
Hmm.
and saw what grew out of it and how the cultures progressed, and then he put that in sci-fi. They're just taking his work and going, well, here, let's tell you what the Butlerian Jihad was. Let's tell you what this is. Let's tell you what that was. It's fucking boring. And it doesn't fit because it doesn't have the same passion. It's why someone couldn't go write, I'm sorry to say this, and people might disagree with me, go write Tolkien books right now because they're not him. No matter how much they love him, no matter how much of a scholar of him they are, they're not him. And you see this in the Conan community too. There are people who will only read the Howard stuff.
I'm gonna bring up one thing here. It's gonna be a little bit different, which is you're gonna try emulating writers that you like, or however you're gonna do it, and you're also gonna emulate those worlds that you want to be in, to live in. You know, for the role playing, the Appendix N. I'll be honest, I didn't start reading that until the last 2 years. Conan. Now I'm gonna go with Morlock. Yeah, I know. I'm not sure what's going on, but the same thing with Morlock. You know, I'm like, okay, or Moorcock.
You disappeared again, Omanal.
Yeah, I know. I'm back. But the same thing with Moorcock. I'm like reading this. I'll be honest. Then I read Jack Vance, and whenever I hear the word High Gygaxian, I'm like, that's how Jack Vance writes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand this whole idea of High Gygaxian when they go, oh, it's this. Go read the other stuff. Go read the translations and the what's the other. I'm also starting to read or listen to rather. It's a lot easier to listen to. Is the I'm sorry, I know what I'm thinking of, but it's the Paradise Lost.
Better to rule in hell than serve in heaven.
Yeah. You start reading that and you start realizing where these tropes come from.
Sure.
It's like, oh, and I think that's part of the hard part that this is one of the reasons I did like Vampire when I was in my 20s, is because they were pulling all this old mythology out. And nowadays it's like, you don't have to learn any of that. It's like, well, then how are you going to have these deep, meaningful aspects and then twist them on their head if you don't read and understand them, if you're not even exposed to them?
Yeah.
By the way, as Slan, there are 2 or 3 books written by Brian Herbert that take place after Chapter House. So they're not only doing prequels, they're also doing some sequel stuff as well. I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but there are a couple of books set now. They're starting to write later story stuff. So, anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that, like you were saying, knowing writers read, first of all, writers have to read. If they don't,
a lot.
Secondly, people have always asked me why I don't like Harry Potter. And they go, why don't you like it? I said, the same reason I didn't like Aragorn or Erebor or whatever that dragon.
Aragon.
Yeah. Aragon. What? Because they're just stealing other people's stories, repainting them and retelling them without understanding where those people got those original story ideas from so they could get the pathos of it, right? But this isn't role-playing. Role-playing, this is again why we can't have the same comparison. You can't say role-playing games are like books because it's different. It's a different medium. I hate to go back to that, but the medium matters. I read a book, I see the movie of the book, I judge them differently. I judge them as themselves. I don't judge the movie as, well, the book was better. It's a different story. It's a different technique. It's a different everything. At a role-playing game, it's controlled chaos for me.
No, I agree with you on all that. It's a different medium, but I think that you have to have those mediums in there to get an idea of what you mentally want. And I think that's the problem that we're having is, when you go through, and that's the part of when you're a little kid, I know better is kind of what the idea starts coming down to. Oh, Tolkien, I know better than he does just because I don't like what he did there. Now I can say certain things like, this makes no sense. I don't like miscellaneous characters that add nothing to the story. As much as people like to argue about Tom Bombadil, but the problem I have with Tom Bombadil is it kind of invalidates the whole thing about the ring corrupting people. It really turns that on its head. If they made it so he didn't do that, then you're like, oh, okay. But it's like, well, listen, there's this corruptible power, and then this one guy just puts it on and takes it off like there was nothing. No, it was supposed to tempt everyone. And that to me is where it threw off part of the book. That's why I hate him being included. But that's that and the fact they threw him in there just because otherwise it was going to be another 50 pages of walking with no action. So
Here's pages describing a mountain. What? Okay.
But that's sort of the point of that book, though, is the craft of the writing. It's like you're either
Yes.
going to like it or you're not.
Mhm.
If you're into just the use of the words, it's a pleasure to read. You drink it up. But if you just want to get to the meat of the story, it's a slog.
No, it's written by a linguist, right?
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Whereas Stephen King is written by a storyteller, and some people love him, some people hate him, but you can't deny the success he's had.
Mhm.
So I get arsed off whenever I hear people, I see these videos all the time on YouTube. Here's 5 things you should never do if you're going to write a story by someone who's not Stephen King.
Never written a story. Exactly.
They've just taken a fucking class. You know what I mean? It's like, well, Stephen King was a teacher. And then he just sat down and started writing shit.
Mhm.
He didn't go get his Strunk and White. He didn't get his elements of style. He just fucking wrote.
Yep.
And over the course of his experience, he developed a style that worked for him. Tolkien had the benefit of being a linguist, so he was able to write in a way that allowed him to really use, as Sean was pointing out, the language in a way that your average writer is not going to be able to do. A military writer who's been through, like the thing he made earlier about my name's whatever and I was a soldier, that guy's going to be able to write about being in the military in a way that someone who's never been in the military ever could. This
And
translates to role playing.
He created a world so rich, and yes, he developed it quite thoroughly, but he left so many little areas barely touched and just mentioned in passing, and gave hints to great events in the past, and just mentioned people in passing. It sets the imagination going, and it's allowed in our time role-playing game designers to come out with things, for example, like this.
Yes.
If you've seen,
yes,
if you've ever seen that book,
Mhm.
you were describing reading as a slog. That's a 400-page source book on one part of Middle Earth.
but I'm going to bring it.
Small print too.
Well,
Yeah, it is fairly small print as well. Yeah.
and people call it a slog, and yet I'm like, I don't feel like it's a slog going through it. But I do also have the other aspect of, but he's brought me in there. The other part is everyone talks about Tolkien on the stuff that he wrote there. I'm not sure how many of you actually, like, I used to read some of, when I was going through college, we had to read his translations. His translations were superior to most other translations that I read of the same story. But he was also well immersed in the mythos of just the real world. And I think that made a big difference in how it helped save it. You never lose anything by learning more whenever you're writing. You only, it's the, we talk about experience, but yeah, I mean, that to me is what I think is so great about a lot of this and why we grew up with it. And whenever I hear did D&D, of course D&D was influenced by Tolkien. And that's why we think of fantasy, because he sold 400 million books. You don't sell 400 million books by being a bad writer, whether you like him or not.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the first. In fact, what I heard was he did not want to have his books in paperback because paperback was for like the pulp.
It was cheap. Yeah. Exactly.
And Valentine did that. When they did that, it opened up a huge audience. Like I said, my grandmother would never have read this stuff, and yet she did. She said it was fantastic to read. And so she loved the Lord of the Rings. So it gets someone like my grandmother, who was not big into the fantasy and stories and stuff like that, to someone like myself who really is, where I grew up on that, along with Creep. I forgot what was the Creepy Magazine or Creep Show or whatever it was called, with which the old really pulp comic book, flip, stuff. I grew up with that. I loved it. So I think that, and to me, to limit yourself to just one medium has the other problem. I remember, George R.R. Martin talking about the Game of Thrones series. There's this one part where he says, you can keep hearing the bells in the background. He says, I can't do that when I write. I can put it in one line, but I can't put the bells keep ringing, because you would be like, you're a bad writer. We know.
I disagree, because Stephen King does that all the kind of time. When he has a point he wants to drive home in a scene, he will repeat the point sporadically every few paragraphs to drive home that point. It's the telltale heart syndrome, right?
Oh,
You're going to have that thing being reminded to the reader as they're getting into the description. Exactly.
mhm.
The only rule of writing that is that if it works for you as an author and people buy your shit and enjoy it, then goddamn do it. The hell with Strunk and White and whatever. The hell with the rules. The hell with Orson Card's books on writing. All the other bullshit. You know, because everybody who ever did something unique is known for a certain writing style. Then fuck the rules. I don't care about the rules. I'm going to write how I want, or I never had any training, and I'm just going to write the way it feels right to write.
I'm going to bring up one other thing though and I've heard this and I don't disagree. You need to know the rules first to know where to break them and when to break them.
I don't
Yes and
necessarily
no.
agree with that. I don't agree with that all the time. Not all the
Well, I
time.
didn't say all the time, but generally that's absolutely true. Is once you know why something exists, then you know when to break away from it. And
But Homer didn't know the rules.
What's that?
Homer didn't know the rules. He didn't have a set of grammar and rules written down for him. Homer just wrote.
No, Homer. If you look at how the Greeks actually learned a lot of stuff, they had rules.
Okay. Counterpoint. Shakespeare.
They were taught but that may have been,
Shakespeare made a lot of the rules.
Exactly.
Yes.
He just made his own fucking rules, and we still teach his shit 500 years later or whatever it is. You know, like, I mean.
Yeah.
I disagree fundamentally, not completely, but like the idea that you have to know the rules before you can break the rules. Yeah, unless you're talented, and then you can just do what you want.
Why dost thou say my line with such reverence? That is a poo-poo joke.
well, no. His whole thing is the, if you're talented, well, very few people are talented. Let's be honest about it.
But if you're not talented, it doesn't matter how many fucking rules you have. You're never going to be a success.
You're never going to write. Yeah, you're the
People aren't going to resonate with your work.
Yeah,
Talent
you got to know the
resonate.
basic rules of writing. You got to know that you have to know how to spell there, and there, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You got to know that kind of stuff. You got to know how to string a basics of how to string a sentence together. The shit that we all learned by 8th grade. If you don't have natural talent or some level of natural talent, I don't care how much practice you got, you're never going to really make it big.
Well,
You
one
don't.
thing is you don't have to know how to spell there, because I've been reading Paradise Lost, and you want to talk about that's hard to read, that doesn't have any official spelling. But when I hear it, but if you do it verbally by pronunciation, then it works great. So anyway, I know we're all joking about these things, but I still think you need to understand the basics of storytelling, and it was taught for thousands of years.
But that's different.
Well, that's to me what I mean by knowing the rules for certain parts. But you still have to know some of it. I'm not saying everyone knows all of it.
But we weren't talking about that. What Joe and I were both referring to was the technical rules of writing. That's what we were talking about, not the basics of storytelling. We learned that as children.
No. To me, writing is storytelling in this case. It's to convey information. And to be fair, you have to know who your audience is to convey the right information. What works in engineering does not work as far as someone buying a book for anything else.
Well, ultimately, you can only bake a cake with all of the ingredients in the right proportions.
Yes, exactly. But you need to know what ingredients. If you suddenly start throwing in, some, you're like, wait a minute, this is not the kind of cake that people want. Maybe people appreciate science.
Baking is science. Cooking is art. Never forget that giant separation in the two.
Yes.
That's very interesting. I like the way you said that. Yeah. I like that.
Or maybe baking is engineering, for a better way of putting it. But
We can come up with a million analogies, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So role-playing games.
Yes.
Okay, but let's go back to that. Let's talk about the rules and experience. All these things we talked about, which was something I wanted to say earlier. All of these concepts we just discussed are going to apply to role-playing. Knowing the basics of how a role-playing game works, knowing the basics of how the story you're unfolding with your players and your friends and whatever at the table is going to work, and the maturity of life coming into play. Because I sure as shit don't run the same game now I ran in 1985.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be embarrassed to sit at the table with me in 1985.
I don't run the same game now I ran 2 years ago. I mean, we're always evolving.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So to answer your question, Tolkien was right.
I like Tolkien, but Tolkien isn't the only thing I ever want to do. That's why, that's why there's an appendix N. And if you look at it, is not only did they pull Appendix N, go look at some of the monsters that are not even from the from Western civilization. That means they had to pull from other stories that he didn't put in Appendix N, like the Indian mythologies, the Chinese, the Japanese mythologies.
Plastic toys they found at a fucking store.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Exactly. But that's what you want.
Creativity.
Yes. Well, and there's
Thank you,
nothing wrong with
Daniel.
Daniel.
and kids have all sorts of weird things too. So you pick up stuff from them. It's like, oh, okay. It's
my buddy's stepdaughters ran a D&D game when they were like 13 or something, and he was describing it to me because they asked him to play, and he was like, okay. And they were describing the game. He was describing the game, and all that I remember was at one point in time, the giant hopping, laughing monster that was attacking the town broke open, and they realized there were 5 goblins inside it. And it's like, that's amazing. I would never have thought to do that. Like that youthful exuberance did shine through. So maybe there is something to youth's innocence or naivete and non-jadedness that can make the stories better.
Yeah, I think that's but that's what helps whenever you start looking at a fresh perspective. You don't want the same person. Real world. Sorry, we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, youthful imagination is a wonderful thing, and if we can find ways of combining it with the experience of life that is needed to craft a world, it's wonderful. I mean,
that's called Monty Python.
Ideally, shouldn't every RPG adventure have once somebody our age creating the nuts and bolts of the world, and then you hand it to a 12-year-old and say, okay, what could happen here? And they'll come up with all sorts of bunky stuff.
I remember. Oh, go ahead, man.
No, go ahead.
I remember reading in a book many years ago. I don't remember what book it was, but a kid was riding a bicycle on a very skinny wall, and he just did it without even thinking about it and ran across, rode across it and jumped off at the end and this and that. And the way the author wrote it was describing the scene, and he says something to the effect of, he was able to do it because nobody ever told him he wasn't or shouldn't be able to do it. I think that's the way kids' brains work. I'm going to do this, and what the hell are you doing? How'd you do that? I just did it.
Well, this is what I'm saying. It's Monty Python, because what Monty Python does is they take the real world, but they have this knowledge of the real world. They're educated men. They've been around, but they have this youthful exuberance of the prosperity of the world, and as a result, they're able to expose it and exploit it. Unlike, say, Blackadder, which is more, the comedy is driven from the seriousness and the insanity of the world, shown in a more wry sort of sense. So that exuberance can give you stuff that is just gonzo, like someone mentioned earlier, Wizards, way back at the beginning of this thing, Bashki's Wizards, and Elfbait mentioned it, and that is a perfect example of a childlike wonder and anything goes, dealing with an absolutely dark subject matter. Like, it's just, if you look at Wizards at the core level of what the story is telling is, it's dark. But then you have like those insane moments. Fritz, they killed Fritz, those lousy stinking fairies, and it's like, what's going on here? It's just gonzo. That's fun.
I've never been a gonzo game, though. Game guy. I could never get into, like, even DCC is too gonzo for me. I don't do that well. I don't enjoy it. Just like I don't enjoy gonzo, I think it is.
You know what, though? I think part of it really comes down to, because when I read it, it depends on how you play, like, everything. I think sometimes the art determines on how we think of it. Because when I read it, I'm like, this isn't really that different than the old modules they used to have, if you're reading some of them. But I agree with you, is that a lot of it is, I like how they do the spells. I like how they do the spells better than the other ones.
You talking about DCC?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't like. That's the funny. I don't like the randomness. I don't want to shoot a fireball and have it zip around and shoot me in the ass. I don't. You know what I mean?
But see, I like it because there's a cost. There's a cost to doing it, and because there's a cost, it makes you cautious of when you do it. And that's what I like, when we're talking about all these things. But you're right. Not everyone wants that. A lot of people are like, no, I don't want that. I want to know when I cast it, it's 100%. And as I'm starting to be fair, reading more and more Conan, no, you don't want 100%. There has to be that. But that's a traditional aspect of when I look at it, is I want players to go, magic is powerful and dangerous, and you don't use it casually or lightly on a daily basis. It's something.
So you like risk reward, basically.
Yeah, well, I do. That's what I think that happens with DCC. But I also like, to be fair, what I really like with one is, if you're also a magic user, is you don't have to lose your spell every day. I don't like the Vancian magic, because when you actually read Jack Vance would have your fighter can fight as a fighter, but then he has a few limited spells. Instead, the way they do it in D&D is like, oh, well, the magic user has a lot less health. It's different than when he was doing it. Now, from a game perspective, it makes perfect sense. I don't have to keep track. You keep track of it. It's a lot easier than trying to deal with spell points and things like that. To me, DCC,
and it's meant to be a team game, so you're meant to have components of the team that fulfill different roles.
Oh yeah. Well, and then the other part is that with DCC is players always have an option to do something as a spellcaster, for the most part, until they lose all their spells. So the spellcaster can keep casting spells, which I think to me which helps out a lot.
That team aspect takes us back to Tolkien. Why did they take Bilbo with them? Because they wanted a burglar.
Yeah.
Beginning the racist trope that halflings are all thieves. I love it. No, I played in a game where we didn't have a thief in D&D, AD&D first edition. We didn't have a thief, and the rest of the party decided, well, we'll just kidnap, we'll press gang a hobbit into our halfling into our service. I'm like, what? And they're like, hey, let's go get this guy.
Now we're back to slavery again. Here we go.
Everything's done. Beautiful.
It's Shanghai. Oh, well, it's not technically slavery. I'm like, look, if you're doing forced labor, to me, it's kind of slavery anyway.
Conscripted, sir. He was conscripted.
That's right. He was conscripted to die for us. No, it's
he wasn't a thief either, so he was really bad at picking locks and finding traps. Let me tell you. Our DM made us pay for that one.
Well, actions have consequences, as they say.
Always.
Again, those are the things I like. I want those aspects from the game. And you're right. Whenever we're doing halflings, why do halflings have such great saving throws? Look at basic. If you're going to do the fighter halfling, that's fine, but boy, look at the saving throws for your halflings and your dwarves. It's incredibly high for their levels. They're like 4 or 5 levels higher than other equivalent PCs.
Yeah, that's one of the perks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
3.5 feet tall. Awesome saves.
That's
because everything misses them. It goes over their heads. So.
Oh.
Boom, boom. Do you guys mix fantasy and let's call it whatever the definition of fantasy? We get into all that before, but what we're talking about now, D&D fantasy, traditional Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy, and sci-fi. I never do. I don't like to.
I don't.
Not my thing.
I don't care for it.
You know what? I don't know how I feel about it, because really, the best example would be Shadowrun.
Sorry, well, that was an involuntary reaction to that word.
No, I understand that, but
I mean, Joe, have you ever heard my ranting about Expedition to the Barrier Peaks?
No, but I've never played the module. I've read it, and I'm like, this ain't for me because of all that shit.
Yeah, going back to, how I really started all of this, going back all years and years and years back. I got involved in an AD&D Facebook group about 2017, 18, and I decided it'd be a good idea to run a poll on that group for the greatest AD&D module of all time, first edition. And I created this big league structure where people voted for things in different groups, and based on percentage of votes, they all the modules qualified all the way through to head-to-head playoffs and everything. It went on for months. Hundreds of people voted, and it was really involved. The idea was to get something better than that awful article in Dungeon Magazine, which was a backslapping exercise. And Expedition to the Barrier Peaks came 3rd or 4th And I remember I riled up half of that community by telling them they were wrong, to put it there.
They are.
I was just, it can't be there. It can't be there. You're wrong. And one of my early videos, I did a series of videos based on what I'd found in that, in doing that poll and reiterating the results in a YouTube form. And I think the most common comment I've had on the video I did on the top 20 was the way I reacted to Expedition to the Barrier Peaks coming in the top 5. people reacting to that.
Well, I mean, I understand where people are coming from for like Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. That said, is looking at, as I'm starting to read more Appendix N, I understand where it comes from, and it doesn't bother me. I mean, that's I'm like that was standard for that for every group for decades. It's like this differentiation that we have between the two really didn't exist until more modern times, where we go, oh, well, this is different than this. They didn't look at it as any different between fantasy and sci-fi. It was generally the same genre when a lot of people were growing up. And I think that sometimes the things that, when we look at now is, we have 50, 60 years of history for this, which they didn't have back then. I say that. I mean, technically some of the stuff comes from the 20s and things like that, but you know what I mean by that. It's go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Jeb, you're wrong. Forrest Oracle greatest adventure ever written. Just so you know, Jeb, in the chat, Forrest Oracle, greatest adventure ever written. It's
Jesus Christ!
It's the fixer-upper of adventures. How can you make this work? Good luck. I love it for that reason.
If you can make Forrest Oracle work, you are the greatest DM who's ever walked the face of the earth.
There's actually a really good blog article that I should send you offline, Joe, that where a guy explains how to fix it and how to make it better, and it really works.
Really?
Yeah.
If you got it, if it's linkable, put it in the private chat.
Maybe I'll throw it in the group chat. I'll give it to Joe Yog to throw in the group chat. Hang on, I got to go through my bookmarks.
Yeah. No, that'd be interesting.
And you put John in the unenviable position of having to put forth a pro Forrest Oracle article.
Yeah.
Forrest Oracle did an exceptionally cute cat right here, being basically exceptionally cute and wanting lots of attention. And
all I see is a video game controller.
There he is. You can see his eyes. He's black.
Yeah, at least you're wearing pants, dude. That's the main thing right there on that angle. So we're all happy about
I'm wearing shorts, but you're okay.
As I said in my reply to that message,
fucking hot in Montreal. I'm wearing shorts. Bite me.
Quite sadly, Forrest Oracle didn't finish bottom in the poll. There were a few modules that came beneath it. I believe there were 2 tied for the bottom spot. One was one of the Dragonlance series, and one was the Red Sonja module. I think they were joined.
I never read the Red Sonja one. Never did.
There's probably a reason for that.
Because it was the bottom.
I mean, there's a reason why it's quite expensive nowadays, because it was reviewed so badly, it barely sold, and no one ever bought it. Sean, did you buy that one?
That's funny.
Which one?
The Red Sonja one?
No, not at all.
RS1.
I have it somewhere, but I never played it or read it.
Neither did I grab the Conan ones.
I got one of the Conan ones, and it was abysmal.
Yeah, I don't really run printed modules as a general rule, so I have very little opinion on that.
It's all I ran in my teens because I didn't have time.
Yeah, and that's what I thought we had to do. I thought that was how D&D worked. I didn't quite know. But I did run the Dragonlance one. But I changed it around so much because it made no sense. And actually, that was my late teens, and I ran it, and my brother loved it. He said it was good because I made it my own. It was my first time I had ever done something like that, where I changed it up to make it my own.
My issue was due to the geography of where I went to school, and the fact that I only had maybe one friend in my local vicinity who ever really played role-playing games. To get a decent group going, we managed to do it maybe 4 or 5 times a year when we could get people together, because I had to travel 12 miles to school, and a number of my friends came from other parts of the city. So when we met up, it was a case of it would take us each about 40 minutes to get to the center of town to a communal meeting point, and then we go back to somebody's house, by which point it'd be midday. We'd play for 3 or 4 hours, and then everyone have to get home again. And we could do this maybe 6 times a year if we're lucky. So running a long, cohesive, ongoing campaign was impossible. So we started loads of modules and never finished them. But that's just the way it was. Just the way it was.
I never had that many in school. It was my brother and whatever friends we could get together, and it was a couple guys. Hey, let's do this. And we wanted to do it. It was a rainy day or whatever it was. We broke my sister into it. Kill her character off. It was just that kind of thing,
I went to a private school where you have to pass an exam to get there. There was a lot of nerds there. But okay. Not many were role-playing game nerds. It was like there was a big chess society and regular nerds, big chess society, and there was a big the school orchestra and things like that. And
what a waste of a collection of nerds,
God. Hey guys, it's coming up on 7 o'clock here. I got to get going because I got to hit the gym actually because I'm old and I want to die early. So
we are within 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Of okay.
The street.
I finally found the link and just threw it in the private chat.
Excellent. Thank you.
So, we're within 5 minutes of the end. So because it is, it's coming up towards midnight for me, which is pumpkin hour. So, and I always have work on a Thursday. I didn't last Thursday, but I didn't stream last Thursday. I'm just pasting the links in a text document, so I've got them for another day. So I've got
I'm going to read that
2 links. So there we go.
Module. It's interesting. I'm curious how we pulled it off, man.
Anything can be fixed with work. It's just how much work do you want to put in?
Yeah,
how much work are you willing to?
Is it salvageable?
Yeah.
Well, that's the way I feel about a lot of systems myself. Is it's like it's whenever people talk about D&D or anything else. It's at a certain point, if I'm doing this much work, I'd rather just use another system.
Yeah.
And that's what it comes down to. It's like, oh, I could do this, and I can do this, and I can do this. Like, yeah, but at that point, why am I not just using the system I like instead of trying to make it into the system that I like?
That's why I went from 5e to 2e. I ran a 4.5-year 5e game, and after a while, it's like I keep trying. My house ruling a 5e was like hacking off branches off a tree, essentially. And I realized at the end, I was just basically, I'm trying to make this into 2e. I'm just going to run 2e. That's what I did.
Mine was the same. That's why I'm now running OSE as my version of D&D.
Yeah.
And how I came to Against the Dark Master was just going through all these D&Ds and going, fuck it, I'm going to play something else. Oh, this I like.
Yeah.
I mean, I am currently running an OSE campaign, a Call of Cthulhu game, and a MERP campaign, a MERP game. So it's I've got the variety there.
Nice.
A pleasant variety.
I wouldn't mind the Call of Cthulhu. I played in one once and it was fun, and I tried to incorporate some Cthulhu-like elements into my game that I run for 2e and the one I did for 5e, but it was always the 5e-ified version of Cthulhu horror, right? It was never Cthulhu horror, so I wouldn't mind playing in one of those a campaign. Or I know Cthulhu never has a campaign because you always go insane at the end, but as far as I know, at least.
No matter how good you play, no matter how successful you are, you will go insane.
Will lose your shit.
Well. I mean that, for example. That's a campaign.
Which is anyone that plays with John for Call of Cthulhu will really find it a positive experience. I did myself. So I know Grumpy Old Slan has as well as Ginger Dude.
It should be noted that when I played John first time, I went insane.
I did.
That's a campaign as well.
The Orient
campaign.
Yeah. I saw those books at North Texas. They had them for sale there, and I was like, it's just beyond my budget. I already blew too much money, and if I saw them earlier, then I would have picked them up. But yeah. No, that's fantastic.
By its very nature, it is a railroad. It has to be.
Yeah.
Because you're on a train.
Mhm.
But it's a damn good one. It's a damn good one. But yeah, Call of Cthulhu can be done as a campaign, but you've just got to slow things down and introduce the danger and the horror a little more slowly.
Yeah.
My group of 4 or 5 sessions into one of the side quests, which is run as like a prequel at the moment, and they're doing all right. They're doing all right. And Omanal played in another prequel to the same one. That's also a prequel to Orient Express.
And yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed. Well, I've played what? I guess it's been 3 adventures because we did the Reign of Terror.
Yeah.
And then we did the what was the other one? The one with the spiders.
Forget Me Not.
Forgive me not. So yeah, I mean, those are, and I've enjoyed being with John there. Gingerbeard was absolutely hilarious as he was going through his stuff. So it's and
Anyone else find it ironic he couldn't remember the module Forget Me Not?
I was gonna say Forget Me Not. I just I was like, is that the one or not? I can't remember if that is.
I'd say it's possibly the greatest Call of Cthulhu scenario ever written, in my opinion.
Really? All right.
It's a modern day scenario, and it's non-linear. And for Call of Cthulhu, that's unusual. You've got a whole lot of free. Sean played it as well.
Mhm.
I think Sean played in a different group to Omanal. I ran it for 2 groups. One after
Oh,
the other.
okay. Yeah. I think that they did that first, and then we were.
Yeah, and then you recap both, I think.
Yes. And it's a modern day one, but it gets around all the technology issues pretty well. And I think it's great because it basically drops you in a situation and leaves you to get on with it. There's no real sort of events to drive it. It's all driven by what the players do,
That's cool.
which is really, really good.
Non-railroady Cthulhu adventure.
And it's utterly brutal and very, very sick and twisted.
The requirements for playing with John's games. No.
Guys, I got to drop it. Thank you so much for having me on. I
See you later.
appreciate it, man.
No
See you
problem.
around,
Take care,
Joe.
everybody.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
I'm gonna have to call this stream to an end now. So I know. Thank you, Joe, for joining in. Joe
Thank you.
the Lawyer has a channel called Joe the Lawyer. So check him out.
YouTube/Joe the Lawyer.
Yeah. And Omanal doesn't have a channel, but Bear and Sean both do. So do your shilling. And I'm going to let Sean go first because he has just hit the 1,000. Well done, Sean. You've got to get away.
Thank you,
Tell us all
everybody,
about
for coming aboard. But yeah, Mage's Musings, recaps, theory crafting, general silliness with puppets and a floating skull. But yeah, no, please. My next big milestone. I've got a giveaway next week. So you got until Tuesday to submit to that. If you're interested in some of the prizes, check out the videos. They'll give you more details. And then I'll start shilling for my big 10,000 giveaway several years down the road.
Well, I don't know about you, Sean,
laid
but you made a big jump once you started putting up more videos again. I saw it jump up from what were you, like $8.50 a month ago or so, or a month and a half ago?
Yeah, I was off for a bit in the beginning of the year, but now I'm back into production mode. So,
And that's key to getting a channel built up is putting out regular
absolutely.
stuff. And you've got to work. Yeah, you've got to work on it. So, Bear, let us know about yours.
I talk shit. People come over and talk shit, and I don't care what anybody thinks. If that's what you like, and you're okay with someone who's going to polarize you and say things you don't agree with, come on over, check out the channel.
Yeah, why
If
not?
you just want to hear good things and live in an echo chamber, stay the fuck away because I'm going to offend you. It's going to happen. I promise.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't normally try to offend anyone on my channel, but I went on Legion of Myth last Friday. I did my Fighting Fantasy stream, reading. We're still reading that on a Friday night.
Oh wow!
Big old book. And I started on having beer while I was reading that. I thought I'm going to continue because last Wednesday I had a horrible day. Thursday was I was in a bit of a still in no mood to do much. But Friday came round, and I quite enjoyed my reading stream. It did relax me a bit. But I started having some beer, and then I thought, I joined in the Legions of Myth stream. We had a very, very constructive talk. I mean, often Legion of Myth can go a little bit off down slightly hyperbolic tangents in terms of culture wars and all that sort of thing. Stuff I tend to try and avoid on my channel as much as possible. But this was a very, very constructive chat we had. And by about 4:00 in the morning, I'd drunk all my beer and half a bottle of wine as well. And
It's a good day.
it was. And there might be a few people who might be offended by a few things I said from there. I used some words to describe some people who consider themselves to be luminaries in our quarters that I think are acting like idiots at the moment. So I think I should have let it go a little bit. I might have let it go a little bit, but who cares?
You can't make friends with salad, buddy.
No, true. But no, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and then we played games all day on Saturday, so that was good.
Nice.
Anyway, thank you all for joining me tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Nice to be streaming again after that little break last week. Things are returning back to normal in my home life, and so hopefully my videos. I know my videos have been quite lazy shorts recently because I just haven't had the focus to do anything really constructive, but hopefully as of next week I should be able to get back onto it again. Thank you everyone in chat for joining in, for contributing, waffling away with us. I like it when chat waffle away with us. But cheers all for joining me on stream, having a good chat, and
Thanks for having me.
I'll see you all again in a week's time.
Good night, everyone.
Take care, y'all.
Bye now. Nope, I guess he's gone. Joe,
Okay.
get in touch with me somehow. I want to have you on the channel sometime, man.
Yeah, definitely. I think
we're still live.
I think we're still live, even though
We're
he
still
left.
live?
That's the funny part.
We're still live. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Bye everybody.
Bye,
We don't know how the
everybody.
crazy thing works. We
Oh,
can't
no.
go back.
I think he forgot to click end broadcast before he clicked off.
Well,
let's
if we all
talk
leave
shit
the
about
studio,
him while
it'll
he's
shut it
gone.
down, right?
Let's
Oh,
talk shit about him while he's gone.
Wait,
That John, what a great guy. I mean, God,
What an amazingly friendly community building guy. All right. Bye, guys.
Later,
I'd
guys.
see you later,
Yeah,
man.
Bear, we'll definitely do a show together.